No. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to see you here. I know we still have a few people coming in and getting settled in. So welcome again. My name is Bridget Terry Long, and I'm very, very proud to be the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I'm delighted to welcome you today to this important event, a chance to focus on what the education sector can do in order to respond to the challenges of climate change. Education and leaders are already driving impact in their schools and communities, embracing evidence-based solutions, innovative practices, and an emerging consensus around education as a key lever for climate action. But how can we broaden this vision and scale for impact? Today, we'll look broadly at how education systems can begin to grapple with their own climate footprint and nurture learning communities that can drive solutions. We'll spotlight promising practices for impact and innovation as we confront perhaps the most important issue of the 21st century. This special event is part of the Askwith Education Forum, our signature lecture series that brings together leading voices, as you will see today, to the Ed School for rich conversations about issues that affect schools, universities, families, and communities. And this is only our second in-person gathering at an Askwith Education Forum since February 2020. And we are thankful to have opportunities to join together again here on campus. I know that we're going to have many additional students joining us for some of our later panels, but I also want to acknowledge that this is meant to be a broader resource for a much larger audience, from our alumni and partners to education professionals and advocates to those who just want to learn. And so I'm very excited to welcome the many people I know who are online. We had quite a few registrants online, and we will be recording this so that this will be available to many others who I know are interested in hearing these conversations. So after the event, the recording of this live stream will also be available on our Harvard Education YouTube channel. Now, you may be here today because you've realized that climate change is not a future problem. Climate change is already happening, and it affects us all. In education, climate change is having a significant impact on learners, families, and communities in the U.S. and around the world. And we have seen devastating effects in just the last few months. Just a few weeks ago, Hurricane Ian caused widespread destruction in Cuba and Florida and forced schools to shut down, with some schools still closed and recovering. Extreme flooding caused by monsoon rains in Pakistan has affected the lives of 33 million people, including 16 million children. And wildfires are the leading cause of recent school closures in California. Unprecedented levels of heat and high temperatures all over the world are another threat caused by climate change, especially in India and recent trends in Europe. And closer to home, at the end of the last school year, rising temperatures forced many schools with poor ventilation and no air conditioning to close around the U.S. And in the schools that remained open, students and teachers were so uncomfortable that their classrooms were not environments conducive to learning. This has important effects. In fact, one study found that students were 12% more likely to fail an exam on a 90-degree day versus a 75-degree day. So the effects are not being felt equally, and the negative effects of climate change are actually disproportionately impacting groups that traditionally have been marginalized. Climate change is exacerbating educational inequality. It is now another important cause of the inequities so many of us are working hard to address. So we need to take action. Addressing the impacts of climate change will require the mobilization of all parts of society. Now, yesterday, some of you participated in the celebration of the new Harvard University Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability. It is a powerful example of an effort to bring together a range of expertise and ideas from across the university to tackle this important issue. Making progress will require policymakers and government, scientists and engineers, planners and architects, public health officials, business, law, community-based organization, and of course, educators. The education sector has an important role to play, and today that will be our focus. With about 70 million students enrolled in school from pre-K through post-secondary education, 1 in 5 Americans are currently connected to the education sector, making education a critical lever for change. What we do matters. And one way to think about this is the sizable environmental impact of schools. With nearly 100,000 public K-12 schools in the US, occupying 2 million acres of land, schools are one of the largest public energy consumers. We operate one of the largest mass transportation fleets in the country with 480,000 diesel school buses. And the American education system serves over 7 billion meals annually, along with the related food waste. So education has been identified as a critical actor in the world's response to climate change, but we've only just begun to mobilize, and I hope the conversations today will spur the action that is so sorely needed. Again, the title of this convening is Education and Climate Action: How Educators Can Drive Impact with Innovation, Urgency, and Leadership. Yes, we must confront the dire realities, and we will hear more about the urgency of the current problems, but we must also learn what we can do to improve things, not only as individuals, but as a community and as a sector. One thing that gives me optimism is the fact that there has already been progress in the education sector. School districts have committed to reducing their carbon emissions by investing in sustainable energy sources. They're saving millions of dollars in electric bills by using solar panels, and solar projects are contributing to apprenticeships and vocational education in the community. In fact, 1 in 10 K-12 schools were using solar energy by early 2022. This is triple the amount than we saw in 2015. Earlier this year, the Portland Public Schools adopted an ambitious and robust climate policy to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2040, retrofit existing school buildings by 2050, and provide climate justice education. And school boards in Los Angeles, Miami, Seattle, and Madison, Wisconsin, among others, have approved plans to rely on 100% clean energy by 2030 or 2040. And across the river, Mayor Michelle Wu of Boston announced a $2 billion Green New Deal for Boston Public Schools investment package with a goal of modernizing all 100+ buildings in the district over the next decade. So there has been progress also in terms of the classroom. Across the world, more schools are teaching students about climate change. At the national level, several countries, including Italy, Argentina, and New Zealand, have passed laws requiring climate education in schools and have integrated climate education as part of their national curriculum. And as of this fall, New Jersey is the first state in the US where all public schools are teaching climate change as part of their curriculum. We must also commend the students and young people who have led as activists, setting an example for us all. But even with that progress, there is so much more that needs to be done. A UNESCO report found that nearly half of the national curriculum frameworks in 100 countries had no reference to climate change at all. Teaching about climate change in schools continues to be politicized, and teachers lack the resources to adequately teach about climate. And as Laura Schifter, who you're going to hear from shortly, said recently on CNN, our public schools received a D+ on the American Infrastructure Report Card. This not only affects our school buildings' ability to withstand climate disasters, but also the public health of our students and educators. Our education systems need to build resilience to climate impact because, as I said earlier, heat, air pollution, and extreme weather are already impacting students' health and learning, and this is only going to get worse in the future. So today's convening is the kickoff of a year-long series of activities and events and programming. We aim to take a learning stance, bringing together a range of expertise, ideas, and perspectives as we contemplate how we can contribute as individuals and as an institution to this important effort. What does the climate sector need to do in order to respond to the challenges of climate change? Educators and leaders are already driving impact in their schools, but how can we broaden that vision and scale that impact? Those are the two questions that are going to guide our conversation this afternoon. During the discussion today and at future events, we will consider multiple ways education and climate change are connected. We'll consider how education leaders can advance climate action plans. And today we will hear from several district leaders on how they have grown their climate action efforts and how others can get started. Second, we'll consider the impact climate change is already having on education and, importantly, inequality. From this, we need to adapt and develop ways to build resilience in our education systems. Third, we'll focus on the teaching of climate change and solutions and think about how can we educate the next generation. And fourth, we'll highlight the important role of student activism and engagement on these issues. So today we're going to touch upon these issues and many others, and I look forward to the future events at which we'll take a deeper dive into each one of these topics. So let's kick off the discussions for today. So it is my pleasure to introduce the first panel, if they would please join me on the stage. Thank you. So this panel is entitled Education and Climate Change, and the goal is to help frame the conversations of the day, providing motivation for why this topic is important, talking about the interconnectedness between the education sector and climate, and effective practices that systems are doing to drive climate action. So I am delighted to introduce the panel, who will begin by each giving some opening remarks before we launch into our discussion. First, we'll hear from Fernando Reimers. Fernando is the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education and Director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative at Harvard University. He is an expert in the field of global education, and his research and teaching focus on understanding how children and youth, how to educate children and youth so that they thrive in the 21st century. He has written or edited 45 books, including a volume published in 2020 on education and climate change, and he served on the university's Committee on Climate Education. Then we'll have Tina Grotzer. Tina is Principal Research Scientist in Education at Project Zero and a faculty member at HGSC. She's a cognitive and learning scientist, and her work considers how to leverage research towards supporting students and developing adaptive expertise to help them learn about and navigate challenges of the future. With colleague Chris Deedy, she developed the EcoLearn curriculum that leverages new technologies to teach complex ecosystem science concepts. And then finally, we'll hear from Laura Shifter, who's a lecturer here at HGSC. Laura is also a senior fellow at the Aspen Institute, leading the K-12 Climate Action Initiative, and she's a fellow with the Century Foundation. Previously, she worked as a policy director for Education 2020, and she also was a senior education and disability advisor for Representative George Miller on the Committee on Education and Labor, and she served as an education fellow for Senator Chris Dodd on the Senate Help Committee. So Fernando, would you please get us started?
Thank you, Bridget. I'm delighted to see your leadership on this topic in our school and to be part of this event where we're beginning these conversations. And I'm very glad to see so many of you coming to think together about how can teachers, schools, universities, and education systems help our students develop the knowledge, the skills, and the attitudes that they need to engage creatively and intelligently in confronting the very issues that Bridget talked about. Now, I hope those of you here are going to take the time to read the university report on climate education, because I think it illustrates what any educational institutions could do. Get a group of your own people together and ask, what is it that we want our students to learn, and how do we mobilize ourselves to do things in the short term and in the long term? And then put some leadership and some money behind it to execute on that strategy. So my hope is that Harvard's report will serve as an example to many of you, and frankly, I hope it'll be of use to other universities. In fact, nothing would help us get a little urgency behind it more than if that little university in New Haven took out our report, made it better, and acted faster than we do on those recommendations. Now, there are two ideas in that report that I'd like to highlight today. The first is that in order to make a difference on climate change, Harvard needs to partner with other institutions, such as schools and districts or other universities, that we are too small to actually make a dent on this issue unless we reach to the rest of society. And that, of course, is a theme that is not new to our school, but it may be somewhat new to the larger university. The second idea I want to highlight is the conclusion of the report, and I'm going to quote, that says, we should recognize and resist the risk of addressing the complexity of climate change by incorporating it in shallow ways that lead our students to end up engaging in superficial advocacy rather than in the essential but harder intellectual and creative work of developing solutions to the complicated challenges and to assessing the trade-offs, like how much are we willing to pay to reduce our own carbon footprint. Now, the idea that education institutions must first do the work of thinking clearly about the intellectual competencies that our students should develop so they can create solutions is one that is relevant, of course, to any educational institutions, whether you're a teacher in a classroom, a principal in a school, a superintendent, or a secretary. And I want to argue that the reason many well-intended efforts to educate about climate change have not been successful, I want to repeat, we've done plenty of things to educate about climate change, but many of them are not only unsuccessful, they are counterproductive in producing people who become cynical to their own ability to address this challenge. Is, I think, because we haven't really thought through what are the skills that we need to be developing. Now, a couple of years ago, I took the time to read hundreds of studies that had actually evaluated the effectiveness of climate education programs. And the results of that work are included in the book that Bridget mentioned, which is an open access publication. You can download it for free. The title is Education and Climate Change. The first chapter in that book is a synthesis of that review of the existing research. And what that chapter shows is that there are many and growing, as Bridget mentioned, efforts reflected in commitments from governments, reflected in curriculum standards, in innovative programs. But many of them share a shortcoming. They are primarily about educating students on the facts of climate change. They are about transmitting knowledge, not about developing skills to do anything about the problem. Knowledge transmission is, of course, essential. A recent survey, which was administered by the National Center for Science Education to a representative sample of U.S. high school science teachers, shows that while 75% of those teachers address climate change in their classes, only half of them do it in a way that is aligned with the current scientific consensus on the matter. And when these teachers are asked to rate their own knowledge on domains which are essential to teach about climate change, only 28% say that they're competent to do that. Now, so clearly, we need to do a better job sharing knowledge with teachers. But when I was reading those studies that evaluated the effectiveness of those programs, I at the same time read the most recent report of the International Panel on Climate Change. And I asked, so what's the connection between what those education programs are trying to do and the argument in this report about what we need to do to address the challenge? And the answer is simply not very much. Many of those programs, the education programs, are based on a dated idea developed in the 1970s about how we are to address climate change, which is basically, if we all are responsible consumers and we recycle, we'll address that issue. And we now know that we will not get to 1.50 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels simply through recycling or responsible consumption. And so recycling is certainly important. I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't do it, but it's far from sufficient. So very few of those programs that have been evaluated acknowledge the reality that the skills that can help us adapt are urgent, because the climate change already baked into the atmosphere is going to produce disruptions for the rest of our lives, even if we succeed at beginning to slow down the pace of climate change. Now, in reviewing that research, I found very interesting experimental studies which combine teaching the science of climate change with what I would call civic education, in providing students the opportunity to collaborate with others in doing something about climate change. And the combination of those approaches, when compared in experimental studies with simply teaching the science, produce very comparable levels in terms of knowing the facts, but very different dispositions. The students who only learned the facts were so overwhelmed by them that they didn't have any hope that they could make a difference. It was only the students who had been given an opportunity to engage in an activity where they could do something that developed some sense of self-efficacy and some hope that we could address these problems. So you all, as educators, think about the implication of that finding, and perhaps about the value of going to the library and sitting down and saying, let's read what has been done and what has been evaluated about these. So based on reading that research, I decided to do a very simple experiment. I invited some of my students to engage with one educational institution, a school in Guatemala, a center to teach out-of-school youth in Pakistan, different places, and to work with them in figuring out in what way was climate change impacting that jurisdiction, and what knowledge, what skills, what attitudes should students develop that in that context made a difference. And then work for a semester, developing a curriculum in partnership with them. And the result of that work is also published in that book. You can read it as examples. But the main idea I want to share from that is, imagine if in each of the 28,000 universities that exist in the world, in each one of them, a group of students and a group of faculty actually took the time to work with teachers, to work with schools, developing curriculum, supporting the implementation of that curriculum, and evaluating what works. Imagine the progress that we could make. Now, I think that is the opportunity in front of each one of us. That's why I'm excited that you're here. And I think it's an opportunity that Harvard's new commitment to this issue and the generous gift of the Salata family perhaps will help us seize.
Thank you so much, Fernando.
Yeah.
Tina?
Thank you. So first, thank you to Bridget, and I guess I'm being heard here. Thank you to Bridget and to the organizers of the panel today. Really so important to see this gathering and this initiative taking off. At yesterday's Salata Institute launch, we saw people from all different disciplines on the stage. And as I looked at those people there, what it said to me is, that's the role of educators, to get those people onto the stage. And that presents a very different view of what climate change education entails than we've really thought about over the past 10, 20 years. So it really does require, for this existential and urgent problem, an interdisciplinary and grouping and collective endeavor, but also it's a highly complex problem space. And so as we think about the urgency of the problem, we all want to do and we all want to act, but it's really education that is the lever that sits between what do we do now and how do we get to deeply informed action. So the research that I've been doing over the last number of years has been on how we reason about complex forms of causality. And it shows that the human perceptual system tends to pare down, simplify, satisfy, look for the most efficient solutions. And that gets us into trouble. So as we think about the shortcomings in our own thinking and how we got here, we need to think bigger and broader in terms of what we do educationally. This is a book that summarizes some of that research. It's available online, and there's also curriculum from the classrooms that we worked on in relation to this work. But despite the many challenges, to follow on from what Fernando has talked about, there are some real points of promise that I want to just highlight briefly. And I'm going to just do a quick sampling of 5. I think that we are seeing, more recently in the past decade, expanded views of what needs to be taught. Educators, researchers, and funding agencies are realizing that it's not enough to teach the science, that we need to do much more than that. And one of the labs that I run here is called the Next Level Lab, and as part of that work, we are embarking on creating an inventory of what's needed in the workforce for the future in terms of thinking green. And we've started in a very expansive way, working with educators in K-12, but also people in workforce development, saying what kinds of things should be included. And the list is long, everything from design thinking to thinking about how to be an individual, an earthling on planet Earth. How do we think collectively? How do we use different ways of knowing to inform our sense of our connectedness and our really joint future on this planet? The second and I'm glad to say more about that particular inventory if there's time later. We're also seeing really, really important attention to the social and emotional issues related to learning about and thinking about climate. The challenges that young people face, and researchers like Maria Ohala and others have really teased apart, what does hope mean? How do we help young people walk between this sort of balance of hope and despair against, despair and apathy to hope and promise and what we can do and sort of action. Also, medical folks like Dr. Ari Bernstein over at the School of Public Health, who's done a lot to think about, as educators, what do we have to do in the details to help them walk that walk in a healthy and safe and resilient way. The other thing I think that we're seeing that makes a really big difference is we're seeing a really nice alignment of the need to engage in action-oriented curriculum with problem-based and project-based learning. So these are pedagogies that we know are really powerful, and when we put them in conversation with our need to engage young people in action to be healthy, it's a win-win. So, for example, a shout out to our colleagues at the Gulf of Maine Institute and their work with the Billion Oysters Project. So imagine 8,000 plus young people in the New York City schools, and they have oyster nurseries, and they are raising baby oysters and measuring them and taking population counts, and then they're putting them back into the bays, and they are monitoring their growth, and eventually they're actually selling those oysters to the local restaurants who are now, they have local oysters back on their menu. But in the meanwhile, these oysters are cleaning the water. And so all the way around, there's great math and science there. And the kids are really engaged in an important endeavor, and one where they can see concrete outcomes. The other really sort of big thing, I think, is that we're seeing a greater focus on bringing the collectivity of wisdom about sustainability forward, on putting different ways of knowing in conversation with one another. So increasingly, people are turning to what we call pluralistic epistemologies. For example, and my apologies for the pronunciation, Etapatamumuk is a Mi'kmaq framework for two-eyed seeing, where Indigenous and Western knowledge are envisioned to work alongside one another as proposed by tribal elders. Resources such as the North Dakota Native American Essential Understandings, teachings of our elders resources, and honoring tribal legacies bring these Indigenous perspectives in very concrete ways to kids all over. We're also seeing technology support for authentic learning in the classroom when it's not possible to get them out, in New York City on the Bay or wherever else. So some of you may be familiar with the Eco-Learn work that Bridget mentioned. So this is a virtual world where students come in and they're able to explore and engage with environmental problems or issues. They need to develop the awareness that something's happening. They have to notice. That's the first step. Then they need to be able to deal well with it, and then they need to be inclined. So they're developing sensitivity, ability, and inclination. And as researchers, we're able to study what they do and what's hard for them, and then use that information to improve the instructional resources. So really important, and those resources are available for free online. They're NSF funded. And then, Bridget asked me to say a couple words about what we're seeing in classrooms. We see states stepping up and putting initiatives in place, such as New Jersey and California. The next generation science standards do introduce climate change into the classroom, not to the extent that I would hope. I would want to push it further, but it's a start. And we also see many, many teachers on the ground teaching climate concepts. But I think it's important not to underestimate the challenges that teachers face, because the details here are going to matter. One of the puzzles about moving from informed action, towards informed action, is the difficulties in those details. And so, for example, in states like New Jersey, they've gone across the curriculum broadly, and they're asking everyone to teach it, and through the levels, really, really important. But then there's a lot of creativity, so, for the teachers who feel comfortable, but some teachers may feel less supported. And then, in California, a more structured top-down approach, some teachers may feel a little frustrated by that, but more support at all levels. So ultimately, these kinds of decisions matter because they result in inequities in the long run when teachers don't have the support. It gets amplified. So, I think that we really need continued research in education. We need continued research on learning in schools. And we also need that important translational and choreography involved in taking those findings and understandings and creating resources that go back. It's one of the reasons why the group here at the Kennedy School, the Subject to Climate group, makes me smile because they're doing that hard work every single day. So I'm thrilled that we're starting this conversation here for the year and to learn together, and I really look forward to those conversations and where we take it.
Great. Thank you so much, Tina. And I want to notice that Fernando is modeling what I said this would be. It's a learning experience. He's up here taking notes, and I have been as well. And Tina already gave you a preview. There's lots of questions. We will get to discussion. She got to jump on some of them as we were preparing for this. But Laura, I want to give you plenty of time because you are straddling both Hugsy and work that you're doing at Aspen. So.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate the thank you for hosting this event and having this conversation. So I think it's a really important step that the Ed School is taking in this. So 4 years ago, climate change was not an important issue to me. It was something I cared about, something that I believed was an important issue to address. But working in education and education policy, there are a lot of problems. And there are a lot of things to address, and there are a lot of things that pull on your time. And the way that I talk about my shift over to this is there are 3 days in my life that have fundamentally altered my life. If other people have had these experiences, they know them. One day you're one person, the next day something happens, and then you become somebody else. For me, it was the day my oldest daughter was born, and I became a different person as a mother. The day that we lost my brother-in-law suddenly, and I learned for the first time the overwhelming power of grief. And then in October of 2018, the day that the UN report came out on climate change on 1.5 degrees warming, I was in my basement playing with my 3 kids, and I got news alert, news alert, news alert. We have a decade left to address climate change and avoid the most devastating effects. And in that moment, all my feelings of motherhood and grief converged as I was looking at my children, and all the problems I had been thinking about the day before felt meaningless. It felt like we could have the best education system in the world, and it wouldn't matter if the full impacts of climate change took hold. I spent a week feeling utterly depressed about the state of our world and walking around with that depression. And then I decided I just had to shift and do whatever it was that I could to work on these issues. I looked at job postings at the Sierra Club. I looked at job postings at the Environmental Defense Fund, and nothing was really sitting right in terms of what those jobs would entail. A couple months later, Jay Inslee announced he was running for president, and he said on day 1 of his administration, he would ask all the departments to submit their plans to address climate change, and it hit me. I didn't have to go to a different field to do work on climate change. I could bring my expertise in education policy, and try to advance an initiative there. And really think about how can, working in the education policy sector, people weren't talking about intersections with climate change. How can we facilitate dialogue and use those relationships to build some initiative to do that? I spent a year talking to everyone and anyone I knew. They'd introduce me to more people, and I talked to more people. I talked to these folks here on this panel. And I found my way over to the Aspen Institute to launch K-12 Climate Action. Spoke with former Education Secretary John King and former Governor and EPA Administrator Christine Todd Whitman. They saw the importance of this work right away and jumped on board. We launched a commission of 22 education, civil rights, youth leaders, superintendents, people on the ground doing this work to learn about the opportunities to engage the education sector in action on climate change, to learn about the great work that is already occurring across this country. So they held a listening tour, and based on that listening tour, they released an action plan to outline comprehensively what the education sector can do. What is the education sector's role in taking action on climate change? This is focused domestically, And they make recommendations for policymakers at the federal, state, and local level to really take action, thinking about what the education sector can do to mitigate its impact on the environment, adapt and build resilience to climate impacts ahead, support teaching and learning to prepare the next generation to advance a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable society, and recognizing the fact that this issue is completely intertwined with issues of equity and social justice, emphasizing that in this moment of transition, we actually have an opportunity to advance equity and center those who are most subjected to educational inequities to receive the benefits of healthier, sustainable learning environments in the future. So this action plan we released last year, with the release of this action plan, we actually then started hearing from people in other sectors saying, hey, we need to do the same thing. So we heard from people in early childhood saying that they wanted to do the same thing as what we've done with K-12. We've heard from people now in higher ed who have been interested in building a similar initiative in higher ed. And we've heard from people in children's media as well that want to think about how they can integrate climate change and climate solutions more into children's media. And so actually just last month, we've relaunched as a broader initiative, This is Planet Ed, to grapple with these issues more. So we are now working in 4 buckets, really thinking about how we can unlock the power of education to advance climate solutions. And I want to leave with just 3 points to hit home on this. The reason why this needs to happen now is it's urgent. I think one of the things that really stood out to me yesterday at the Salata Institute launch was the first slide. This is the greatest single challenge of our time. And so the time is now for us to do this. You know, Bridget, you outlined all the impacts that we're seeing. The flooding in Pakistan is devastating. Hurricane Ian is devastating. The impacts are here today. Students, families, and communities are feeling them all across the country and the world, and that is only going to increase. So the time is now. Education is going to be critical to solutions. When the UN released a report this past spring, the UN Secretary General came out and he said, the commitments that we have by countries right now are putting us firmly on track to an unlivable planet. We have the scientific, technical solutions to address this issue, and what we have lacked is the social and political will. All of us here at the Ed School believe in the power of education to change social and political will and to really lead that effort. And so education has to be critical to advance solutions. There was a 2019 poll that was done that said 14% of teens felt that they learned a lot about climate solutions in school currently. If we're talking about the greatest challenge of our time, that number needs to be 100. The other thing just to add to is that there's benefits to education in doing this work. There's benefits to education in engaging students. You know, we saw the NAEP scores decline. There's been a lot of talk about students being disengaged in school. Potentially why they're disengaged is because what they're learning in school is not matching the reality of what they're seeing outside of school. So this provides opportunities to engage students and meet them where they are. This provides opportunities to advance equity. This provides opportunities to build healthier, sustainable learning environments for students and educators to breathe better air in their schools, to, you know, get on buses that don't have diesel fumes. So there's benefits to education in doing this work as well. So I'm really encouraged by the fact that we're having this conversation today and leading this effort forward, and look forward to seeing all the work that the Ed School is going to do in the year ahead too.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And thank you everyone who's joining us. We have a little bit of time. We're going to take about 20 minutes for a bit of discussion. So if I can get that going. Fernando, I want to start with you, but I hope others will join in. Mm-hmm. On the Committee for Climate Education, you did a bit of a review of what's happening here at HGSE and also learned other examples at Harvard. I'm wondering if you could share some of the things that jumped out at you as being particularly promising.
Well, one of the things that we observe is that there are a fair amount of opportunities for students to learn about the science of climate change, and low-hanging fruit is just making that visible for all students. It's in the nature of our university that we are a universe, but it's not easy to find all the good things that are happening here. So there are already opportunities, low-hanging fruit, in terms of making visible for most students what exists. I also think that in participating in that report, one of the things we did was to talk to our own colleagues. We talked to you, talked to our faculty, And there is interest on the part of a number of faculty at the Ed School already in addressing these issues. I just learned yesterday, serendipitously, through one of his students, that one of my colleagues is actually engaging his students in finding solutions to educate our own students at the Ed School better about climate change. And I think, again, low-hanging fruit is to make that, provide those opportunities for mutual recognition so we know, okay, who else is interested in that? Who else could I be working with?
You gave me the example of Joel's deeper learning class.
That's it.
Yeah. I got to meet some of the students. Maybe you could share that.
That's the one I was referring to. That's exactly the example I was referring to.
So they're working on projects where I'm going to be getting a series of recommendations about what HGSE can do, and they already shared notes about tabling that they've done with their colleagues.
Yeah, and so, I mean, this is such a vast institution that there are many opportunities for us if we can connect the dots across the various departments to do extraordinary things. We're not great at connecting the dots because our structure of incentives pulled us towards our own home departments. But my hope is that this initiative and this institute is going to have sufficient heft to kind of force us to engage with colleagues in other places. For example, I know that we have developed curriculum for high school, not we at the Ed School, our colleagues in the sciences have developed curriculum for teachers to learn more about the science of climate change. I've looked at it. It's a great effort, but it's an effort that would have benefited tremendously from what is known here about what works in professional development. This notion that you can just distribute nuggets of wisdom on the video and that this is going to change the shared practices of teachers failed to use things that are common knowledge in these schools. So that's just a simple example of how we could take an existing asset and then add value by bringing other people to the conversation. And my sense is that our school in particular, because this business of engaging with the field is not considered a distraction, but it's part of our work, we can be very helpful. The reality of this committee in putting together the report is that it didn't take us very long to realize that even if we succeeded in doing a better job at educating every single Harvard student better on climate change, that really would be a drop in the bucket because, as you and both of you have said, this is an issue that involves behavioral change of 8 billion humans. And this institution, with all of our $50 billion, from the grand scheme of things, is really inconsequential to that unless we figure out an intelligent way to partner with others. That's why I think this conversation is important. That's why I think the participation of the school in the larger Harvard effort is especially important. So I'm excited that this might be good, not just for climate change, might be good to model what universities should be doing at a time when more and more people ask, what good do universities do for society anyway? Well, if we could show that we actually can do something about the most critical existential challenge facing humanity, that would go a long way.
Okay, so let me broaden and ask a slightly harder question. So the great news is that there are promising practices. There are things we know, knowledge and expertise that we can apply to solving this problem. But we also know we can discover all the most amazing things in the world, and research doesn't necessarily get used in schools and communities. So what is it going to take to bridge that gap? What's your advice? How will we help schools, districts, communities to apply some of the things that we've been learning?
I think I'm going to reiterate something Fernando said to lead into my answer to that. But I think coordinating the efforts that we have and learning from those with whom we are working is key. So, Michelle, I'm going to call you out over there. So last year, Michelle said, I want to know what's going on here, and I want to coordinate the efforts across the university. You know, this is happening, and that's happening, and that's happening. So how do we bring those opportunities to people the day they walk in the door? So this year we had an orientation for students to help them know what resources are here and how they can be connecting the dots. And that's been amazingly generative, but that comes from a student from last year. So sort of handing that on. And I think that spirit needs to come to the work that we do in classrooms. Teachers know their students, they know the students they're working with, they know their local environments. It is really the curriculum efforts that take those forms of expertise and put them in conversation with what we know from the research and some of the resources that we have here at Harvard that I think are most generative. The work that I've done has been at the intersection of learning and the cognitive science and the learning sciences, and really saying, what if we push here? What if we push there? And then they push back on me and they make it even more real. And that's where we get some of the best curriculum and the best solutions. So I'm just going to say that we need to continue working with the field. We need to work with our former students who are out there doing amazing work. And I think that will bring forth the best of who we are, if we can make that connection.
Okay. Great. Laura, could I bring you into this? With the report, how's it been received, and how are you helping districts and leaders bring about action?
I think the report has been received really well. I think there's a lot of opportunity for action that is already occurring, and I know the next panel after this will highlight some school districts that are doing some great work out there. And we need to continue to get this out more. There's still not enough awareness. There's still too many people within the education sector who don't see climate change as their work or in their lane. Largely, I think, because they don't know what to do or how to advance solutions within what they do. And so our hope is to kind of continue to bring this out more and help educators learn how they can talk about climate change. So just even thinking about it, two terms that are used a lot in climate change, mitigation and adaptation, and thinking about how educators can think about, okay, climate mitigation means how am I impacting the environment? What is it that I can do to reduce that impact on the environment? Adaptation means how are we going to be impacted by climate change, and what can we do to adapt and build resilience? And so helping educators continue to understand these terms, learn about it in terms of what impacts them in schools, what impacts their students, their families, and their communities is still an effort that we need to all do. And it's something that I know our commissioners, Secretary John King, Governor Whitman, the teachers union presidents, the superintendent of Chicago, they're all working to talk about this issue as well. And so the report has been well received. It still needs to get out there more. And so one plug that I have to any of you all here is within where you work, if you can help push this out too, to help more educators see the ways that they can take action on climate.
Sure. And one thing you haven't mentioned, actually, for schools, you can actually save quite a bit of money. This can be incredibly cost effective. Yeah. If even all you're thinking about is dollars and cents.
Yes, so the energy savings have a lot of opportunity, and there's actually federal investment now that can help school districts access money, access tax credits that are in the Inflation Reduction Act. Oftentimes schools don't think about being able to access tax credits, but one of the things that they put in the Inflation Reduction Act was something called direct pay, which allows for non-taxable entities to actually get funding directly to do this work. So there's money out there, there's money on the table. The investments being made now can actually then save districts annually on their budget. There's a school in Arlington, Virginia. It's a net zero energy school. So there are places out there that show how this can be done. It's a net zero energy school. It produces as much energy as it consumes. There's a tower right in the center of the school. It's called a power tower. Students see every day when they enter the building how much energy their building is producing and consuming. Students then can see, oh, let's all turn off the lights at the same time in our building on this day and see that consumption drop. They'll talk about when it's a cloudy day, how does that change the amount that they're producing from their solar panels on the roof. And that building saves the school district over $100,000 annually on energy costs because they don't have those energy costs. So there are fossil fuel free schools out there. And by the way, that building, you talked to the architect, you talked to the designer, did not cost more to build. It was about being smart in the way they did it. So the angle of how, where the building sat had to be maximized for ensuring solar panels were facing the south so they could generate as much energy as possible. So it's just about thinking about things differently, and the benefits build upon themselves.
Great. So as Laura just alluded to, so we have the Inflation Reduction Act, we have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we have leftover funds from the American Rescue Plan funds. So it's a unique time where there actually are resources. But you hear from schools that they're not actually using them, that they're not sure what to do with them. And 2 weeks ago, we had a convening on COVID recovery and what's needed to support learning acceleration and student wellness in the teaching profession. I wonder if you could share, what's your advice? What would you say to schools and districts and educators? What would you hope to see during this moment of time when there actually are resources available?
I wonder if in education we sometimes hope to solve problems at a scale at which they cannot be solved. And I have learned working with systems and networks of schools that the school, even the largest school, is often a very small unit at which you could develop, for example, a really effective transformational climate science curriculum. You don't have enough staff. But I think what a single school cannot do, a network of schools aided by a university can do amazing things. And I think part of what we need is a mind shift on how do we organize ourselves to do this work. That's why I'm so insisting on the power of university-school partnerships, a topic that I address in this book and that the UNESCO Commission on the Future of Education kind of pushes, because I think it is that scale and that integration across institutions that is going to help us develop truly transformational climate change curriculum. I want to mention one thing, I want to add one thing to what has been said. The literature on climate change, of course, talks about the need to adapt to climate change because this is built into the atmosphere. We're going to live with the consequences. So that means figuring out how do we prevent fatalities when there are floods, when coastal levels rise, when we have extreme temperatures. The need to mitigate it kind of slow down. But I think that literature also talks about the possibility of reverting climate change. And that involves largely science, engineering, and invention. There are really cool things happening by way of putting nanoparticles in space that can deflect some radiations, by research in developing safer ways of nuclear energy, for example. And that's why I think it's important. That's what I meant when I said educators should be asking themselves, what's the full range of capacities that we need to develop among our children? And it has to go beyond understanding that this is here, and yes, there are all these terrible things that we have to adapt to, but they should include also stimulating them. For example, Bill Gates developed a passion some years ago on toilets. It's really smart, because he realized that the conventional toilet, if we were to expand that technology to the entire world population, it would have catastrophic events on sustainability because of the amount of water that it would require. So he actually approached a number of universities. I think he came here and he said, would you help me design new toilets? And universities turned him down. They said, we're not interested in that kind of problem. And think about it for a moment. We're not interested in solving one of the most important challenges. And he finally got some people to do really clever work, producing a different kind of toilet. Well, this is part of what our educational institutions should be doing, equipping students with the skills to be inventive, whether it's inventing toilets or safe nuclear energy, whatever it is, in hope that we might actually be able to revert these things, not just about adapting to it. Anyway.
Well, in relation to that, we know a lot about how to teach design thinking. We know a lot about how to help people turn problems inside out and look at them in different ways, to analyze the assumptions that they're holding, even if they've lived with them every single day. So how do you think about your daily activities and say, well, should I really be flushing all the potable water down the toilet? Things like that. So I agree. I think that that's as we start to think about what does it entail to teach young people about living sensitively in our climate, given the crises we're involved in, it really is bigger than it's design thinking. It is thinking about our resources as limited. It's engineering. It's all kinds of places where we know a lot about teaching these things and we could be employing these things. And in doing that, we bring more people to the table and we are building upon different kinds of strengths and talents. But I do think that we often ask educators to make revisions just like we would, as if we were changing the wheel on a moving car. And so we need to give them spaces to talk about these things. We need to offer them effective models. One of the reasons I love the Billion Oyster Project is because teachers get it. They see it and go, oh, that works in this way, and this way, and this way. And they see how something like that can be powerful, and then they bring it to their local context and start saying, what can I do that's like that, analogically speaking? So I think, I think there's a lot of promise for expanding what we think of in terms of teaching to climate education, and also to really giving teachers opportunities to do that thinking with us.
And I also think, too, in addition to thinking about equipping the students, is a recognition that many of the adults that are in the system might not have the knowledge and awareness of what they can do to do this. And that's a critical thing that we can do in terms of helping them understand the federal opportunities that are available right now. I think providing that technical assistance, educators will jump on it. One success story from this past year is there's $5 billion allocated within the infrastructure bill to help schools transition to electric school buses. It's important to know $5 billion is not going to be sufficient to actually transition the 480,000 school buses that are out there, but it'll catalyze action. And they did the first round of funding. They had the applications come out this summer. They were planning to release $500 million of that funding. They got applicants from every state across the country, and based on those applications, they actually decided to double the amount to $1 billion and announced the first awards yesterday or 2 days ago on who's getting these grants. So schools are ready to do this work if they know how to do it. So letting them know, how can you use American Rescue Plan funds to do this work? Making sure that if you're replacing your HVAC system, you're not adding one that's going to be based on fossil fuels that'll be in the system then for 20 years, but you're actually thinking how to do this wisely. And then helping people know with the case studies that you're not just integrating that into your school, but you're using that as a living lab that students can then engage and learn about that transition as well.
Okay, with the last 2 minutes of our panel, last question. We have many wonderful students here. We have students watching us online. We have alumni who are also joining us. What's your one piece of advice to them if they want to get involved?
Read the report of the International Panel on Climate Change, and then ask which competencies would be helpful for students to gain that would make a difference, and how can I help? You will remember that about a decade ago, we hosted Malala Yousafzai here. And when she came onto the stage in Sanders Theater, we all stood up and we gave her a standing ovation, and she said, please, please, I don't want you to think that I've done anything extraordinary. It's just that in a context of grave injustice, the actions of one person can make a big difference. And I think that's what we see with the example of Greta Thunberg, this woman who at the age of 12 convinced her parents to change their lifestyle so it reduced the carbon footprint. At the age of 15 was advocating in front of the Swedish Congress. At the age of 16 began a global school movement asking for changes. The actions of a single person will make a big difference. And that is each and every one of us in this room.
Collaborate with us. Look for ways that we can learn together towards new possibilities and new solutions, and let's take it from there. And that's, an invitation both to current teachers and to our former students and our current students. So it's really working together.
Laura?
And I would say talk about it. I think we can't underestimate the importance of talking about this issue. It can be scary and it can be hard, but we have to keep talking about it. There's too much silence about what it is that we're facing all across the country and across the world. But not being afraid to lead these conversations and lead with values, lead with things that are shared values, and recognize that this is a personal issue. Oftentimes we can talk about it and it feels like it's science, or you're using, terms like decarbonization that can be off-putting to people, but ultimately our ability to thrive depends on a stable climate, and that is something that will impact all of us personally where we are. So don't be afraid to talk about it.
So please join me in thanking Fernando, Tina, and Laura for this first panel. All right, so we're going to have a short break, and we'll be ready for panel number 2.
Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you. I'm Jen Cheatham, a faculty member here at HGSE, co-chair of the Public Education Leadership Project, and thrilled to be talking with this panel of practitioners today. Can we give them a round of applause and welcome them? We have not only our in-person audience, but an audience that is listening in online. I want to welcome you all to this particular panel. We're going to have a conversation with 3 school district practitioners who are taking on climate action directly at the local level. We're going to try to get into the how of this work and not just the what. But let me tell you who we have here today. So first, we have Ben Mackey. He's a board member for the Dallas Independent School District, which serves 145,000 students in 233 school buildings. In 2020, the Dallas School Board adopted an environment and climate resolution and a related committee to bring that resolution to life. We also have Dr. Monica Goldson, who is the Chief Executive Officer for Prince George's County Public Schools, which serves 132,000 students in 209 school buildings. In 2021, the school board voted on a resolution declaring a set of climate action goals and has since adopted a climate action plan. And we are very lucky to have Leanne Kittle here, who is the Director of Sustainability for Denver Public Schools, which serves 89,000 students in 205 school buildings. Their board passed a policy focused on climate action earlier in 2022 and are currently working on creating a new sustainability management plan while continuing the work of the district's sustainability team, which is what she leads. I do want to acknowledge that Dr. Alex Marrero, superintendent in Denver, was supposed to be with us. He's not feeling well. I hope he recovers soon. But we're thrilled to have Leanne here in his place. Very lucky to have the person who does this work day in and day out every single day. So I want to just very quickly acknowledge some of the dean's opening comments. The challenges are many, and this is indeed an existential problem that brings us all together. But in schools, low air quality, unsafe drinking water, diesel-fueled buses, underinvestment in school buildings, food waste, right? The list goes on. We have major challenges that only we are responsible, right? We're very well situated to address. Today we want to have a frank conversation about how to initiate and grow efforts to advance climate action, given how well-positioned schools are to make a difference. We want to talk about the actions these practitioners are taking that are the most promising, the impact they hope to have, and their advice about how to get started. We have a glorious 60 minutes together, so we're going to dive right in.
All right.
To the first question. Okay. As I mentioned, this is the challenge of our time. Why is it important for you as a school district leader to take action on climate change? I want you to think about why is this work important to you personally? And in addition to that, how were your efforts initiated? Monica, I'd love to start with you.
Okay, let's start with me. So why is this so important to me?
Yeah.
One, as an educator, we always want to do something that's better and prepare our environments for our children. We want the best for them. That's just innate in us. And as I looked at all the problems that we faced in terms of climate change, I felt completely overwhelmed. And you add on top of everything else that we experience as a school district, I knew that in order to really create a better environment for students, we were going to have to stop talking about it and actually do something about it. And during the pandemic, we have this motto, never let a good crisis go to waste. And our board, one of our board members said, you know, while we're still in this pandemic and trying to figure things out, I have a leader of a climate parent group in our county called Climate Parents for Prince George's, and representatives from the Sierra Club that want to come together and create a task force so that we can begin to research what we can do about climate change. You have a lot on your plate. There's no way you're getting ready to convene this group real quick to do anything. Why don't I begin that process? And I will be completely honest, I was relieved.
I bet.
Because I felt like I had so many other things that I had to address. And this was a priority. I just couldn't find the time in the 24 hours in the day to execute it. And so these three groups of people came together and created a panel of 22 that included students as well. And that is how our climate change action plan was birthed.
I love this idea that, I just want to say back something that I think I heard you say, that sometimes we're not acting because we're not interested or we don't think it's important, but we just simply have too many things that we need to make progress on simultaneously.
Exactly.
So having partners who can help share the burden and move the work forward is important. And you had this particular group that initiated the plan. I love that. Ben, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with the why this is important for school systems. And I've been in school systems all my career. I was a teacher, I was a principal, I was assistant superintendent, and now I serve on the school board. And at every level, and I'm sure if you talk to any adult or student or general and ask them, why do we have schools? They will give you some variation on, we want to make sure our kids are able to thrive in the future, whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
That's great, and that is what we should be doing. But we also have a responsibility to make sure they have a world to thrive in. I think about what Laura said about we can have the best education system in the world, but if we don't actually take care of the world, they're not going to be able to do anything with that. So we cannot abdicate our responsibility as school systems in this process. And throughout my career, and why this is important to me, I mean, I remember taking a class in college about where the environmental sustainability crisis at the time. And now I look back 10, 15, 20 years later, nothing's changed, frankly, except we're farther down the path. And it was really interesting in my time as a principal, hearing from students and what they're passionate about. This is top of mind.
Yeah.
And so often we as a system can lose sight of what students are feeling. And I think where you're going to have a system that truly educates kids, you're helping their reality that they see match what they're experiencing in the schools. And in Dallas, so when I came on the school board in 2019, there was already underway a student movement. They were showing up to school board meetings. They were talking about the need for this and the desire. It was not from one school or one class. It was high school and middle school students from across the district showing up over and over and over and saying, here is what we expect of you. And it took that persistence to then motivate into action. And so based on that, we were able to author and get forward to the board an environmental and sustainability climate justice resolution. And that resolution not only recognized the need for this in our system, our responsibility in this, but also, the equity implications of climate justice. When you look at Dallas and you overlay where our census tracts are for income, when you put on top of that our achievement in schools, it's almost perfect. You map that over federal redlining or state redlining in the 30s and 40s, and those maps are the same.
Yeah.
And then you map asthma rates right on top of that, and it is the same. It is all the same issue with the same roots. And the students know that this is not news to students. And so it is incumbent on us. So this resolution not only set the need for it, but it also mandated that the school district work with community members and appointees and the administration to come up with and really dive into this, not just set some arbitrary goals and let's go, but dive into 6 different elements of the work, whether it's construction, curriculum, food service, purchasing, energy, and come up with recommendations and goals, and for the board to consider and eventually adopt those goals. And so that's how this work started getting going in Dallas ISD.
I really appreciate this emphasis on students, and they did their homework, right? They're pointing out the historical roots of the inequities of climate impact in your community, which is phenomenal. Leanne, how about you?
Yeah, I have a very similar story. So we had 30 students across 8 different schools throughout our district during a pandemic, during a time they didn't even know each other, to come together and urge our leadership to take climate action. And if you really think about that, really put yourself as a high schooler. This is after class, this is after soccer practice, this is after debate class or debate team.
Right.
This is after dinner with mom and dad, brothers and sisters. They met on a consistent basis for a year and a half to urge our leadership to pass a climate policy. And I actually want to read our policy because I think it speaks to how holistic they view the issue from an environmental justice perspective as well. So we passed it in April of this year. I want to give a shout out to those students because it took a year and a half for them to get that adopted by our Board of Education. And it reads as DPS shall be a national leader in establishing an organizational culture anchored in sustainability, climate action, and environmental justice in both the conservation of natural resources and in minimizing the carbon footprint of our district's practices.
Oh, that's great.
Can we have a round of applause for these?
Yes. Right? The persistence of young people. Leanne, you were going to say something else.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, and so for me, I actually meet with these students every Wednesday for the last year and a half. I hear their climate anxiety is real. They are nervous because wildfires in Denver are happening in their backyard. Shorter winters are happening in their backyard. Some of the world's worst air quality last summer in Denver in their backyard. So climate anxiety is a real thing for them. And for me, and the work that I do at Denver Public Schools, is how do we change the narrative? We want to get away from, this catastrophizing of climate action or climate anxiety and all of these words that give worry and anxiety to these students, but change that narrative to one of action, one of innovation, one of accountability. And so my job I see as truly just changing the narrative for these students so that it doesn't feel like a faraway goal, but something that they can do right here, right now.
That's beautiful. I want to get deeper into this conversation about the how. We talked about how the work was initiated. Clearly something that you're all passionate about, but initiated by students, by community members who care about the health of their community and our world. But getting it started is one thing, keeping it going is entirely different. And I want to talk about what you're doing as a system to drive ongoing change. So in other words, what has been especially important about the process that you've used to center climate action and to continue to work on it? Resolutions get passed by boards all the time.
Yep.
You know this.
Yes.
It makes you feel really good for a few minutes.
They go on a shelf.
And then they go on a shelf and things go back to normal, right? So how do you sustain the work and keep it moving forward? Ben, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right about that. And so often we talk about it high level, and there is a difference when your vision doesn't match your execution.
Yeah.
And so in Dallas, I think what has been absolutely critical to seeing tangible improvements is buy-in. While this was led by students, it wasn't just the board saying, we're going to pass a policy now, and that'll be that, and now they'll go through it. Because a policy is only in the governance aspect of things. It doesn't change how we manage, how we write procurement bids, how we do all these other things. And that's not necessarily the school board's role to nitpick every single one of those. That's why we've got administration. We've got to work in partnership. And so what this resolution laid out was an explicit demand for a group to meet, a collaborative group. It involved community members, experts, and administration, very importantly. And so they had to say, the maintenance director had to say every step of the way about what could work and what couldn't work. And so from all of this, the 6 areas we hit were construction, maintenance, curriculum, energy, food service, and transportation. And there was, over the course of a year, it was supposed to be 6 months, but it actually is so much to dig into. It took a year to really flesh out what could be, goals. I think tangible goals are a critical component in monitoring progress to them. And B, a variety of different specific tangible things we could do. Some of which were regulatory, some of which were management, some of which were policy, some of which were budgeting. And then we reviewed that. After the completion of that was deliverable. This committee presented to the entire school board and the superintendent, here is what we're recommending in every single one of these areas. And from that, you had buy-in from everyone. The staff is on board with it, students are on board with it, the community is on board with it, they understand and see the vision, the board sees that, and then it's a lot easier to sustain and move the work forward. So I think that was really important. And I'll talk about, I think later on, we'll probably talk about the specifics of those effective practices. But that was the process, to really do it in collaboration and to be specific about the outcomes and giving time and ability to buy in around those specifics.
And there was teeth, right? The committee had some teeth because it was a board-appointed committee, it sounds like?
It was partially. So board appointed some community members, but we also had experts that were brought in by administration and the administration themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, and who facilitated it? Sorry, I'm really getting into the weeds because I want our listeners to know who facilitated it.
So in that case, it was jointly done by myself as a board member and the administration representative.
Love it, love it. Monica, how about you? Tell us about the process.
So I think something that Ben said was really key. If you listen to his 6 areas, those areas are systemic focus. Those really weren't school building driven. So I have over 200 school buildings. I have 135 schools that already have been identified by the state of Maryland for being green school identified. So we were doing things in our school while central office and adults were going on with their regular everyday behavior and acting like only recycling was their contribution to climate change. And so it really took the creation of our action plan to come back to what are we doing systemically. So we have 8 priorities. We have 58 action items that really lay the groundwork. So we call it our roadmap. And a part of that process is that I lead that work because I believe that what gets monitored gets done. So my organization, our school district, knows this must be super important to her because she leads the meeting every month. I have a team of 40 employees within our school district who meet with me to go through, and they're assigned very specific action items. I'm on an action item myself. So those priorities, those 8 priorities, we call them subcommittees, they meet before we come back together as a whole group. So that sends a message to the organization. It's not going anywhere.
Sure does.
We're all part of the change, and we have to change adult habits. Our children are so far along and ready to move us forward. It's us.
Yes.
And we have to own that it's us, and we have to do something different. And so we meet once a month. We have what we call a rolling agenda that lists what action steps we took. But because I'm the one leading it, I believe that people aren't just going to put anything willy-nilly in the blog. And I am known to read everything that comes in front of me. And so I don't allow people to come back the next month and say, ditto, a continuation of what I wrote the previous month. The template is wiped clean. You have to put in new action items. So what did you do from the last month to this month that's different?
I love how hands-on you are. My goodness. But can I ask you a follow-up question? My understanding is that your climate action plan, this work that you monitor as closely as you just described, is very much aligned with your district's strategic plan.
It is.
And in addition to that, this is amazing, it set the standard for your community, and now the county has decided to create their own action plan, sort of following in the school district's footsteps. Can you say a little bit more about that?
So it's so important. You said it before. A lot of times we will create policies or documents and they'll go on a shelf. And we'll just say, yay, we did it. Laura, you'd be proud to know your action plan is actually on my desk, not on a shelf. But we knew that in order to make sure that there was complete buy-in within our district, we had to connect it to our strategic plan, which we also did during the pandemic. Because we realized we had an audience who would pay attention to everything that we were saying, and we used that time to get community input through surveys and have meetings virtually to help drive our strategic plan. But the other part of it is that I am the largest employer in our school district. So I have 20,000 employees that I employ for Prince George's County Public Schools. So if I can change the mindset and actions of those 20,000 employees, I'm also changing the carbon footprint for the district. So that then caused our county to say, wait a minute, we've got to align our actions with yours, because if not, we're being counterproductive. We're fighting against what it is you're trying to accomplish.
And I also just have to share my appreciation for the fact that You didn't have the bandwidth to personally initiate this work, right? You shared your leadership with others. But then when you were ready, you stepped in very powerfully, right, to take a central role.
I think you said it was key. It's not that it wasn't something that was super important to me and that I knew we needed to do. It was just that I have so many things on my plate.
Right.
And that I need a team. If anyone ever believes that a superintendent does it by themselves, they are completely wrong. Mm-hmm. There is a team of people. And in this case, I think it's so powerful how we spoke about board members and leadership help to drive the vision in the district. You can't do it alone. There has to be a partnership between your Board of Education and your administration to really push the work forward.
I love that we have a board member, right, CEO, administrator, and the person who's responsible, again, full-time for the sustainability work in Denver. Can you talk a little bit about your take on
Sure. It's really hard not to clap each time a panelist speaks, so I'm just sitting here giddy. But yes, we really approached it with 5 main things. We have a climate action plan, which is very similar. We have 6 frameworks within that action plan, which is built environment, transportation, resource management, wellness, career and curriculum, and engagement and environmental justice. So with that plan, we have 3 what I call North Star goals. Those are 2050 goals, but this is a 5-year plan. So the intent there is always keep our eye on the prize with these 2050 goals, but recognize that you have to have year-over-year strategies, and you can't look too far ahead because then it gets overwhelming and you feel like you can't actually move the needle. So this plan's for the next 5 years. Then the next thing that we did is where sustainability is placed in the organization, I think is crucial. So my team, we used to be under facilities, which was where most sustainability starts off because it starts off as energy management. It has grown to be much more across the entire district in all aspects to be more than just utilities. But that was the foundation and needed to be there in the beginning. It's now recently moved to be under what we call strategic operations. So still on the operational side, but we have a lot more connection to the academic side now. So where it's placed is incredibly important. We also hired a grant writer because our panelists before had talked about how important it is to take advantage of these federal, state, and local dollars. Well, I'm not a grant writer, and we don't necessarily have capacity to have grants specific for sustainability. So we have hired a grant writer to help us with take advantage of those incentives. The other piece is website, and communication's huge, marketing's huge, branding's huge. You have to be able to communicate these things, and some of them are very complex things that you're trying to communicate. So how do you engage students, teachers, staff members in what you're doing with climate action so that it isn't something that just sits on a shelf, but you're actually engaging the community. So website, I'm really excited in the next 2 months we'll have our launch of a brand new website. But then the last piece I wanted to keep, because I do feel like this may be one of the more imperative pieces to our approach at least, is a financial impact assessment. So we've hired an engineering firm to help us. How do we get there? How do we do this? How much is it going to actually cost to electrify our buildings and our fleet? How do we do that? And so that financial impact assessment is very complementary to our climate action plan. And so then when we go forward to our district leadership, we can say, this is how much we're going to move the needle if we do these strategies towards our 2050 goals, and this is what it's going to cost, and this is what we need to essentially communicate to our stakeholders of what it's going to take to get there.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd love to just call out something that I think is just under the surface, but is so important, is that there's not one person in a system that will do this, and you kind of touched on this. And so you heard 3 different perspectives on what it takes, but if you've got a person in the district who is doing this work day to day, if the superintendent doesn't see the value in it or puts that as a secondary thing, that work's not going to go anywhere. If the superintendent is trying to do this themselves, that is not sustainable.
Correct.
And if you don't have a board that knows its lane and able to support the superintendent and the system in that, it doesn't work. And finally, if you have a board member who's trying to do this work themselves, even though that's not their job, that just causes entire mess and confusion. And so I think it is really important to recognize that you need a coalition to move this work forward in a sustainable way. And the members of that coalition have to know and be okay with their own individual roles. I think you look across the country, you see school boards that oftentimes get out of the governance lane that they are set for. Most of the times, people don't even know what governance necessarily looks like or is. And when you look at the organizational theory and research behind it, it's about setting the vision and monitoring progress in a lot of ways. And so in Dallas, we set the vision with the goals in conjunction with administration, and we do the other thing to the teeth is every year on Earth Day, actually that month, we always have a progress monitoring about our goals.
Excellent.
We don't do the work ourselves. I'm not there in our sustainability manager's office being like, what are you doing about this? What are you doing about that? And it can't work that way. And so it does take this coalition that knows their roles and their lanes and can work in conjunction with one another.
Excellent point.
And I just want to add to what Leanne just said, it's key to have that dashboard piece. So we're working to have a data dashboard because people need to publicly see what you're doing and how well you're moving towards your goal. But our students need to see it as well because their actions contribute to the data that's in that dashboard. So whether it's energy conservation, waste consumption, it's really being able to track that progress and more importantly, the savings. I think that was brought up in the previous panel. We already have a request for proposal out so that we can get a company who can help us monitor, maintain, and track our use of energy.
Excellent.
Yeah, if I could add to that, it's also being vested in your own school. So as administrators, they're not paying the utility bills. The district's paying the utility bills. At least that's how it works at Denver Public Schools. How do we get them engaged in their actual carbon footprint and recognize how some of their practices are impacting the natural environment with that built environment? And so being able to communicate with them and get them personally vested, I think, is really how you move the needle from a behavioral perspective.
I'm so glad you brought up more than accountability and monitoring mechanisms, but communication routines. When I went on the Denver website, I was thrilled to see your annual report. I mean, it was not only beautiful and easy to read, but it got me motivated and excited. And part of what I'm thinking about is how you not only communicate, but keep this feeling of urgency. Can you say a little bit about that? How do you continue to, because there's always that spark in the beginning, right? The students were feeling the urgency and helped you feel the urgency. But how do you keep people feeling the urgency and motivation to keep going beyond accountability? Yeah.
I think you get the students to be involved in that process.
Yeah.
So they're the ones that created the why. They're, as you see, 3 examples here, students have been part of the why. So getting them involved in that climate action planning. For an example, we have a district leadership presentation on the 1st that we will present our climate action plan goals so that they hopefully can give us the thumbs up and we can publish in December. But the students are coming and presenting. I actually had to get parental agreements so that they can miss a class or 2 to come and present to district leadership. So I think that's going to show the sense of urgency because they're front and center and part of the real world experience of the implementation. And I really wanted the students to be involved in that implementation because it's easy. I say easy, it took them 1.5 years and it was a lot of work. But to get to that policy piece, but where the rubber meets the road is actually implementing that policy. So that sense of urgency comes from continuing to have the students involved, at least from my perspective. So
yeah, I'm going to agree that the sense of urgency does come from our students. But for them, it's because they see their time in the school district is short.
Yeah.
And they want to see change now. So they want to be able to say, I saw this happen before I graduated, and I had a part in seeing that happen. So whenever I visit a school, they'll stop me. Where are we with food? I just saw somebody put fruit in the trash can. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. So they're constantly pushing us to change our behavior. And I don't think that will stop. Then the other part of it is that as a leader of a school district, if you've done any research around the longevity of a superintendent, our tenure is short.
Yeah.
So I always have a sense of urgency because my days are numbered. And so I want to be able to make sure that there's sustainability beyond me.
Yeah.
So that's key. Those 40 people that I meet with every month, they're not at the top of the food chain. They're in the middle part of the organization. no matter who sits at the top, they're gonna still be there. And they're gonna continue this work long after I'm gone.
I would add it and take this a different direction too, is that I actually believe, we talked a little bit about like monitoring and accountability and checking progress. I think that does inspire people to stay engaged.
Yeah.
And I think about anyone that's ever played a sport knows that if you play whatever sport with a scoreboard versus playing one, we're not going to keep score at all. There's a very big difference between the motivation of people. No matter what sport, no matter who you're talking about, what ages, it doesn't matter. The scoreboard matters because it tells you where you are, and people want to be a part of something that they're building to that is bigger than themselves.
That's true.
To see the progress and go,
Yes.
dang. And so I think about, to your point about, principals I was a principal. I didn't think once about the energy consumption in my building. I just thought about, I always get complaints about how hot it is. Just open the windows. Don't worry about what happens later on. To see and change behavior, now Dallas ISD shows the energy usage by buildings to principals. And there are ways that, hey, if your energy usage is going down, the money we save, we're going to roll that into your budget next time. Because that's money that would be going to education anyways. The question is whether it just goes out the window, literally, or you can use it for something that you find more valuable.
Excellent.
And all of a sudden, as the principal, I can see the scoreboard, I'm paying attention to it, and there's a benefit to kids on my campus for doing it. I think there are little low-hanging fruit that are really powerful movers of adult behavior because adults want to be part of something bigger than themselves.
Progress is motivating.
Yes, I was
Yes.
going to say competition, but whatever.
And that.
But I would agree, like engaging the adults as much as the students as well. But I'll leave it there actually. But it's a really great point that it takes the entire community to be engaged.
Okay, I'm letting us stay in this conversation about process because the strategies mean nothing if we can't get people to take them up, right? And so I just want to stay in it for a minute or two longer because you mentioned principals, and we've talked about mid-level staff, CEO, board, students, right? The kind of grassroots element, community. But I want to stay on the role of teachers and principals, school-based staff. Can you say a little bit about how you've motivated, you gave one great example just now, Ben, school-based staff to take up this work?
So gardens is a great way because it's very easy to incorporate curriculum and get the students outside, have that physical experience. It also helps with behavioral issues and just like a litany of benefits to gardens. So we have 120 gardens that we manage across our district. And that, I heard wow, that's good. It is a lot. And we have one person managing that. Hats off to you, Chris. But also we're working on curriculum development, so it can be plug and play. I think the first panel talked about how do teachers teach this when they aren't necessarily climate scientists themselves? And so we're developing curriculum to really be a plug and play for teachers, and then they can tailor it as such. But I think supporting them in this endeavor is incredibly important as well.
Yeah. So for our 135 schools that have been identified by the state of Maryland as green schools, they have to demonstrate one, that it's embedded in their curriculum and that they've been able to execute the strategies that are in their curriculum that yield a benefit to the school environment. So that's been key. They apply every 4 years. So you can't just say, oh, I'm doing this and never come back to it.
Okay.
And then we also go and monitor. So our educators are leading the work in the classroom. We too have gardens, not as many as you have, so clearly we need to get moving. But even in our high schools, we've had students who've grown their garden and have then used those foods to create a salad bar. Which our students are saying initially when they came and say, hey, we want to talk to you about food in our cafeteria, I really just thought they're getting ready to ask for Chick-fil-A. But that was not what they came to me to say. They were like, we need some healthy options. These are not, the options that we have are not working for us. We don't want pizza every day. And so it caused us to really look at what we were offering and to find fresh options for our students. And so while we were well ahead of the game pre-pandemic, we've got to go back to where we were because that slowed our progress down.
Okay. Any additional thoughts from you on school-based staff? And then I want to get into these specific strategies.
No, I echo what they said. I don't think I have too much more to add there, except for, and I'm thinking of, I think it was Laura again who mentioned this, or something along these lines. But I think about, we have a lot of, we see school generally as a place where students come to learn so that they can go off and do. And that, I think, is wrong. And it should be a place where you learn and are empowered to act and just continue this cycle. And what we see when students are not engaged is it might be because the reality in school doesn't match the reality out in the world. And so how are you not only just teaching students about accurate information about the climate, environmental, and sustainability, et cetera, how are you helping them know what channels they can go through and fostering them to go and act upon this and go and say, we're going to go talk to our school board? And I think about what would happen at any of our school districts if there was a consistent group of even a fraction, 100 students that showed up at every school board meeting saying, this is what we're rallying around and we want to see differently in our schools. I bet you would see a ton of action.
Yeah.
And I think, how do we foster students to not only learn, but also act in the moment and not just wait when you graduate, then you can act.
I love that thought about student activism and how we want to nurture it. Okay, one more question on this subject. Okay. I'm so sorry. Let's talk about resistance. I'm just curious. How does it show up? Does it show up on this particular subject? And how do you think about it?
Oh, yeah, it always does. If you think that in any environment, everyone is 100% on the bandwagon, you're sorely mistaken. A great example would be we just finished contract negotiations and the leader of one of our unions said, hey, I need 10,000 copies of the contract. No, we're not giving you 10,000 copies. It's posted on the website. Go to the website. We refuse to be a contributor to us not wanting to change our own habits. And so we have to push back. When you find that people are very complacent in their own actions, you push back. You have to call it out. A simple board meeting where I saw water bottles sitting on the counter. Hey, didn't I give you all reusable bottles as a gift? Let's pull those out, people, before we cut that camera on. So you have to start with small things, but you have to, if you say nothing, you're perpetuating the continued actions that are never going to get you to where you need to be. And it's those small things that will eventually get you to where you need to be by all of our targets of 2040. We want to be in a better environment by 2040. I want my own children to live in a better environment. I want the 131,000 kids that I support every day to be in a better environment. And I don't want to be the reason why they can't be.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
So resistance is real, but I think it's not as prevalent as it used to be, at least in the 15 years that I've been in sustainability within education. It's definitely not as prevalent. I will say, though, as a public institution, when you're responsible for taxpayer dollars and there's optics involved, how do you create an environment that's comfortable with innovation and don't have a fear of failure? And that, I think, is probably the core reason for resistance is I don't want to fail. I don't want to be the reason this doesn't work. Yeah. I mean, you could easily talk about budget or other things that come up for resistance, and those are real challenges. But at the end of the day, how do you create an environment that allows for innovation, for things to maybe not work?
Right.
Thomas Edison, right? I think it was like 99 times before he got it to work.
Thank you for sharing that.
I think the resistance that I've seen in both these veins is one of either two things. One, it's from a financial purpose and a lot of misunderstanding about how much this costs and what it could save you on the back end. So I think there's a big clarity on helping understand that. We said Dallas ISD moved towards a fully renewable energy contract. There's big reaction to that. How are we going to cost too much? It's going to be X, Y, and Z. And then we said, and it'll save us $1 million a year. Okay. And so then it quieted it really quickly.
Yeah.
And I think some of those like that is a very easy one-to-one to try to attack that. Some of them are more difficult. We talk about the construction, and maybe it did work in Arlington, Virginia, where we have a net zero school that was done at no cost. If you get bids on it though, and you do see differences in cost, it changes the dynamic. So how are we like really helping propagate meaningful, real information in a centralized way to help sense make for different contexts about how much it actually costs and how much can it save over the long term? You're only considering construction costs. You should also consider maintenance costs or lifetime costs. So I think the finance one is one resistance that I think takes strategy and communication for. The other one, and the biggest one, it's not even individuals, it's just organizational inertia. We've had that policy for 12 years. Why am I going to look to change it? Because if I look to change it, then everyone's going to want to add something, and it's just going to be chaos, and we're going to have to do things differently. And
that's real talk.
That's where it goes. And I think about, I think about some of the effective practices that we've put in place, and just how low-hanging they are. Literally, just putting in our construction documents that white roofs will be painted on buildings instead of black roofs because they reflect more sunlight and have a big impact. That's just changing a word in a construction document, but it has a huge impact. I think about, we just had a line that all future energy contracts will be renewable.
So do we.
Cool. Then it's just as hard to change them back, too. So then you make the organizational inertia reward the behavior that's most important.
Beautiful. I mean, there's a political realm here, right, which we've been touching on that I just wanted to lift up, right? The communication, coalition building, celebrating, kind of small wins. Were you going to say something else, Monica? And then I want to move on.
I was going to add, the resistance is really an opportunity to educate.
Yeah.
And so we're having these conversations every day in our work environment. We're talking now about turf fields. Several years ago, we were implementing turf fields, and now it's come to a complete halt. And so I have coaches and players who are like, wait, when are we going to get our turf field? You're not. And let's talk about what the impact, what we were doing to our environment, what we were doing to you by installing it, and why we can't move forward. And really educating to show that, now that we know better, we have to do better. And I think for our students, for adults to admit that we were going about this wrong allows them to see that sometimes we make mistakes.
Yeah.
We don't know it all.
We're learning.
And we're learning as well.
So let's get into some of the strategies, some of the ones that you think are most promising, that you'd like to see your own district or other districts begin to pick up. Leanne, do you want to get us started?
Well, I think this will answer that question, but
I know you wanted to get in there.
I'm sorry, I was trying to follow up on something you had touched on, Ben. So we as a district are still defining this. So what I'm about to say again is in the process. But triple bottom line, that economic, environmental, and social is incredibly important when it comes to capital improvement projects. And so, or planning rather. So we're talking, and again, this is in progress here, talking about social cost of carbon, talking about emissions, first cost versus life cycle cost analysis, and also end of life planning. What happens to like furniture at a school, for an example? We get a new principal, they want all brand new furniture. What are we going to do with the furniture that's now going, to the landfill? So end of life planning is also incredibly important, but how do we changing that narrative? How do we change the narrative of capital improvement planning so that it's not just first cost? Recognizing that that's always going to be a challenge, especially in K-12. Even with the federal incentives, it's still going to be an issue for us. So it's not that first cost isn't going to be part of the criteria, but how do we have a holistic view of these capital improvement planning by including environmental and social as well?
Thank you for that. Anybody else want to chime in on specific strategies that are promising, working, need to be scaled? What do you think?
I'll go. Definitely, the Build to Learn Act has lots of funding around infrastructure, around transportation.
Yeah.
And I'm sure all of the districts here have applied for electric school buses. I have over 1,000 bus routes. Blessed to be able to get 5, but we're going to need to scale that up a little bit faster.
Yeah.
Because if I'm just getting 5 buses a year, we would have all fallen off the face of the earth by the time I get enough buses. It's just reality. We've started to put in electric charging stations at our central office locations. We've been very specific around putting priority parking spaces at schools for hybrid any electric cars, to encourage just a small thing. Teachers, you don't have to walk that far if you have a hybrid car. You can park right up front. Right. Those small things help us. We've started with technology use. We are a one-to-one school district now, thanks to the pandemic. But now we also have students who are repairing our devices for us. Instead of contributing to just saying, hey, we're just going to buy some more, they are fixing those devices for us, and we're paying them to do that in the summer and after school. For our furniture that breaks, we are refurbishing that furniture ourselves for our students in our CTE program. Awesome. And we have a CTE Grow Your Own program where I have students who are working alongside our electricians, carpentry, paint shop, so that when they graduate, I can hire them back as employees in our school district. So they're helping us to go back and refurbish those items. We've put in water fountains in all of our schools so that students can bring in their water bottles so that they can refill their water bottles themselves and not ask, hey, can I get a bottle of water from somewhere? So we're starting those small steps, but our students are seeing those actions and are beginning to at least appreciate that we've heard them and that we're starting to move that way. In our elementary schools, we have small baskets at the exits of schools. When they come out for lunch, if they don't eat that fruit, they're to put it in that basket. That basket is then placed at the front of the school door at the conclusion of school for students to take with them if they want to take it home or need fruit on their ride home. We're moving towards the middle and high to do the same. So we're taking those steps so that our students are helping to drive that work, but we're changing our actions as well.
Sounds like a culture shift.
It is a big culture
shift. It's
not
any one strategy, but many together that represent a larger kind of point of view.
And you have to start where you can see measurable change.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes I have over 200 school buildings, but in offices, you include those as 233. But literally changing it where there's no motion in the room, that the light goes out. So sometimes we could be on Zoom and the room will go dark on someone. Yay, that's a good sign.
That's a good thing.
That's a good sign. That means it's working. So we're starting those kinds of actions to change.
I love it. Ben, you've got some good news to share.
Yes. So we, like all the other districts, we applied for the grant, and we just were awarded 25 electric school buses from the EPA.
I'm going to take some of yours.
So I'm excited about that. And I don't have a ton of other little snippets. I think they hit on a lot of snippets of things you can do. And it's not just one of them. It's doing all of them, and doing them consistently and thinking that way. But going off of this grant for school buses, like that in and of itself isn't going to necessarily change it. And I want to take this, I think the pandemic really highlighted something about schools. So what happened when school when the pandemic happened and school shut down in the same manner? All of a sudden, school districts became responsible for closing the digital divide. You realize how many kids and families school districts sustain, things that fall outside this realm of direct education, but nevertheless fall on the school district. I think in the same way we see, when we talk about city management and police forces, police are generally asked to be mental health professionals or all these other things, or we would hope that they are. They're the ones that have to solve those problems. And I think what this highlights is we have to think differently about how we collaborate to actually put the resources in the place they need to be and actually move towards these outcomes. So I think about this school bus grant. That's great that we have school buses. And part of that is Dallas ISD is now going to be able to help start thinking about the infrastructure for how do we sustain it? How do we charge them? Where's that energy coming from? All this type of stuff. Dallas ISD shouldn't do this alone. So now this gives us a leg to talk to our local transit system, DART, our city, who is starting this process as well, and say, how are we collaborating to get to some of these root causes? Similarly, I think one big unique thing that Dallas ISD did recently, we passed a large bond, $3.5 billion in 2020, to really modernize all of our buildings over the next decade. Part of it included this thing called joint project funding, which was funding specifically earmarked for capital-esque projects that would be done in conjunction with another partner, a community college, DART, the city, the county, et cetera. And I think about that because that money has been able to leverage other entities who, funding is always the question. Well, we can't be the only ones that pay for this. But now we have that money to say, hey, DART, if you all will go in on us with an electric charging station that we can both use as we go in this, we've got some funds, you've got some funds.
Yep.
One way that it's actually started to happen now is one of our policy changes we made was to identify for all schools, 30% canopy cover would be our goal. And that had never been a part of our conversation, so we planted whatever we happened to plant at that time, and it just was what it was. And so now we're thinking differently about trees and parks, et cetera, around our schools. And this money was allowed us to partner with a couple of nonprofit entities to actually turn our playgrounds, redo our playgrounds to improve them, but hit the canopy cover goal and turn it into a joint city park. So during the school day, you can lock the outside gate, it becomes a playground. Then when you leave school, you unlock the outside gate, lock the inside gate, and now it's a park.
Yes.
And so that is a way that you are getting partnership to this work. And I think that is the only way we're going to solve. School districts alone can take some steps, but if we're truly trying to solve this, it takes changing behavior in a community with all the entities engaged.
Yeah, go ahead, Leanne.
I swear I want to clap every time.
I know, me too.
Clap every time.
Brilliant.
So similar to that, we have, so Denver Public Schools has collaborated with the city and county of Denver. They have a $40 million climate action fund where they just recently put in their first community solar. It will be one of 11. We will be a host site, and so we don't own it or maintain it. We're just hosting it. And so DPS as a district, we receive a portion of that energy generated at a guaranteed lower rate. And then what's really awesome about this project is that throughout all 11 community solar gardens, about 30% of that power generated will go specifically to DPS families in need through utility assistance program. And then additionally, we have another pot of gold, if you will, that we're working with the city on to install solar shade structures in outdoor classrooms to really show the students how solar works, because more often than not, it's on a roof. You have no connection to it. Even if you see a dashboard, which is really great as well, you still don't actually see a solar panel to feel and understand what that means. And so we're going to have solar shades so that students and the surrounding community really understands what renewable energy is. And so
I love it.
I have a litany of other examples, but I thought that community piece was worth touching on as well.
I so appreciate that. I mean, throughout the conversation, we've touched on so many different strategies, right? About food and gardens and renewable energy. I mean, curriculum. There are so many ways to work toward climate action, and it's never one strategy, but many in combination, ultimately about culture and cultural change. So we have to wrap it up. I knew this time was going to fly by. So I want to do one final speed round, and I'm going to ask each of you to share two things. One is give us a glimpse of what success would look like for you, right, in 1 to 3 to 5 years. But what do you hope will be true in the near future? And then secondly, any last words of wisdom, advice for those who want to begin the work of climate action in school systems? But those two things. Anybody want to start? What do you hope to be true? What's your advice?
You might have to ask the second question again, but the first one, do you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm next.
My hope is that in the first year, students are involved in the climate action plan, in the development of it, knowing what it takes to actually implement a policy. And 3 years from now, I hope that they are outside of the built environment and into the natural environment, meaning in gardens or seeing what solar canopies look like or EV charging, and actually learning about science, math, art, all of the subjects right there on their campus. And then in 5 years, I hope they're out in the real world changing the landscape of our nation, which is a big task, but they're up for it.
And what's your advice for people who want to get started?
Create a strategic plan and stick to it. It is incredibly difficult when you have so many organizations who are wanting to work with you, so many partners and ideas and community members who think this is the focus we should have or that's the focus we should have. Create a 3 to 5 year plan, stick to it, and then also a financial impact assessment to understand financially how do you do that. But don't deviate. You certainly can have strategies year over year that can change that we consider a working document, but don't allow the goals to change, because as soon as you do, you end up not really moving the needle towards those 2050 goals.
Love it. Monica, how about you?
1 year, first year
Nice,
goal
nice.
would be to, we're planning to execute a Ready Climate Leadership Summit this summer. And the sessions will be facilitated by students, administrators and leaders in our school district, and community members. One, trying to give strategies for everyone in our community that they can utilize both at home, in their work environments, and to support us in the school environment. 3 years, I would like every single employee, 20,000 of them, to be able to vocally identify at least 3 strategies that they are using to support our climate action plan, which means that they would have had to have read it and be able to execute at least 3 of those strategies. That's where true sustainability will come from. And then in 5 years, I'm believing that for our school district, we will be able to track our progress over those past couple of years through a data dashboard. We'll have the opportunity to demonstrate that we've had some financial savings and that we've been able to redirect those savings back into the classroom.
Love it. What's your advice for people who want to get started?
Don't hesitate. I know that it seems to be extremely hard to do, but there's so many resources. The Aspen Institute is a great place to start, but act now. You can, if you think that, oh, I can do this next fall, it's too late. We're already behind the 8 ball. So you can do it. All you have to do is partner with just a few more people. And we've all said students will help to provide that sense of urgency and direction for you, but you have to act. You have to do it now.
Thank you. Ben, how about you?
So I think for what I hope to see in 1 and 5 years, and I'm going to take this from a more political, social standpoint. Number 1 is monitoring progress and seeing progress on the goals that we've set. Boards, organizations, they love to do a strategic plan. They love to set goals because it shows we've done something. Then it falls off immediately. And we say we're doing it, but we don't quantitatively measure, are we making progress or not? And the reason is generally politics. We don't want to show that we're not making progress. And that's hard, that reflects poorly on me. And I think we should throw that out. It shouldn't reflect poorly because that's what also breeds distrust in the system. And parents say, you set those goals about reading or whatever, and then you don't show us if our kids are learning. I know they're not, I can't figure out where the ball is. And so I think we have to hold ourselves accountable for monitoring progress and looking at the reality of the system, ugly or not, and just taking that not as a personal reflection on the superintendent or someone else, but saying, how are we all implicated in this? And then how do we mobilize the resources if we said that's important to make progress on it? So that's my big hope for the shorter term, that we actually can build those systems to monitor progress and do it in a way that's not punitive. The second bigger thing is in 5 years, I would really love to see, especially, I'll take Dallas specifically, collaboration on these things between large bureaucratic government entities being just how we do business rather than just a headache of red tape. Like, we should see each other as partners in a way to leverage what we're trying to do and not just, it's going to be a lot of work to try to move this forward. So that's what I hope to see. And my feedback for someone getting involved, it's around getting involved. But I think more than that is to be persistent without being pushy and be an ally in it. And I can think of a lot of people, and actually, no, I can't, because school board members, I represent hundreds of thousands of people that live in my district, millions across the Metroplex. I don't get a ton of emails. Not a lot of school board members do. You can have a loud voice just by simply engaging. And when I do get emails, usually it's about, I want this, and that's a real reason. That's great. We should listen to that and engage with that. But what's really powerful, especially for something systemic like this, is say, I want to be an ally. Here's what's important to me. I have ideas. I can engage people. What's important to you? If the values align, then how do you help partner with that school board member to move it forward? And if you can do that in a way, you will see the action happen a lot faster. And we're seeing in national politics, school boards are starting to take front and center stage because they wield so much power. I think about Dallas. I think it was 2011. School board elections were canceled because there were no one challenged the incumbents. This board controls $2 billion in public funding, and it's just not getting a ton of engagement. So engage in those ways.
Run for school board. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, there you
Run for school board. We need more school board members like you. Thank you for that. Everyone, thank you for your time, your wisdom, your commitment to climate action. It means a lot to me personally. I feel very inspired by the work that you're doing. Keep doing it. I think our school districts could become models for climate action if we work together. Everyone, can we give this wonderful panel a round of applause?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, I think we're taking a short break, and we'll be back for the next round soon. Is that right? At 5:30. Okay, 5:30. See you there, everyone.
Thank you. Oh my gosh.
Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get settled for the last panel of the day. So hello again, my name is Bridget Terry Long, and I'm the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I'm pleased to welcome you to our third panel of the day entitled Acting Now for a Better Future. Welcome to all of you who are present in the audience towards the end of this day, although I know we have over 150 folks online, and I expect that many are going to be accessing the video as well. Throughout the afternoon, we've considered how education leaders can advance climate action plans. We've acknowledged the impact climate change is already having on education and discussed ways to build resilience in our education systems. We've also heard a bit on teaching about climate change and solutions and how we can improve how we are educating the next generation. During this session, the goal is to take a higher level lens on how we can think big, how we can engage broadly to build a movement and move the levers for action on climate issues. As with the overall theme of the convening, we will consider what does the education sector need to do in order to respond to the challenges of climate change and how we can broaden that vision and scale that impact. Additionally, how can the education sector work in collaboration with other parts of society to bring about improvement? So I am delighted to be joined by two incredible thought leaders in this area, Jim Stock and Spencer Glendon. Jim Stock is the Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability and the Director of the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability. Jim's background is in empirical macroeconomics, monetary policy, and econometric methods, and his current research includes energy and environmental economics with a focus on fuels and U.S. climate change policy. In 2013 to 2014, he served as a member of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. And as Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability, Jim leads the development of a coordinated university-wide strategy to address climate change, bringing greater focus, clarity, and visibility to Harvard's extraordinary breadth of work on climate and sustainability. And then we'll have Spencer Glendon, who's the founder of Probable Futures and a senior fellow of the Woodwell Climate Research Center. Collaborating with scientists, designers, technologists, and others, he founded Probable Futures, a nonprofit initiative that aims to change how we think about, talk about, and plan for the future of our society and our planet. Spencer is also a consultant to many institutions, including McKinsey & Company, and again, the Woodwell Climate Research Center. He's an occasional guest on media, including recent appearances on MSNBC and Bloomberg, and he has been a guest lecturer at MIT and Stanford on climate issues. So we're very happy to welcome you back to Harvard. So we'll begin with opening remarks from Jim, and then Spencer, and then we'll come together on stage for a conversation about the issues. Jim?
Thanks so much, Bridget. That's great, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to do it. So Bridget asked me to say a few words about the Harvard Climate Initiative and about the Salata Institute. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to say a few things about this particular program. I am going to really I am really going to emphasize to you, I am an economist, I'm an econometrician, if you want to talk about Ukraine and natural gas prices, that's great. I am not an expert in education in the world of the GSE, and I'm not going to pretend to be. So I might say some things that are going to be kind of naive. Maybe sometimes that's useful. Sometimes it's just naive. Okay, so let me say a few things about the Harvard Climate Initiative. So a little over a year ago, President Bacow appointed me, announced that we had divested from fossil fuels, and most importantly said that we really want to be moving forward in a constructive way here at Harvard. And I think that's incredibly wise decision, and it's something that we need to do. So climate change, as an economist, I like to think, and especially one that worked in the Obama administration, where we worked really really significantly to make forward progress on policy in climate. I like to think of the possibility of having government actually be really effective and efficient, and we introduce efficient policies, and then we have a smooth transition to a decarbonized future that is going to be equitable across all the impacted communities, and we'll also do that in time to avoid the worst damages. Things are a little bit harder than that, and I think that we're not in a position to really count on government carrying a lot of water. It's wonderful that the Inflation Reduction Act was passed and supported, and that we're going to have a big build out of wind and solar and so forth as a result of that, but we have far, far, far too much to do to really rely on government. We have to have all of our leading institutions pulled together, and universities play a special role. Universities are perhaps the leading, most important and most enduring institution in the Western world, and it is something that we collectively have a big responsibility as universities to work on. And Harvard, as a leading university, or perhaps the leading university, has a special responsibility to work on. The problems of climate change are ones that go across all of our different disciplines. It doesn't fit just within the business school. It doesn't fit just within the sciences and arts and sciences. It doesn't fit just within GSE. It goes across everything that we do. And if we're really going to make progress, we're going to have to make progress together. It's great for us to work with our graduate students, for us to work in our labs, for us to have our own projects. That is really important, but it's not enough. We have to be able to come together if we really expect to have impact on large and wide-scale problems. That's what we're doing in terms of my vice provostial job. That's what we're doing with the Salada Institute. The Salada Institute is going to does sit at the center. It is a university-level enterprise, and it will be the central hub for these sorts of activities. We're not going to be too top-down. We're not going to tell people what to do, but we would love it if people communicate with each other, and we would be very happy to support cross-disciplinary work. We are in the process of supporting some cross-school research programs, which we are choosing among other things, to be impactful so that they really affect real-world problems in climate, and they're going to have short-run visible impacts. We will also be doing longer-term work and supporting longer-term research. We'll be supporting curricular activities here on campus. What can we do here? And actually, we had a report by a climate education committee, which had representatives from all of the different schools, including GSE, on it. And that's right. And so lots of different folks from across the university participated in that. And we have actually, it turns out that that's already been impactful at other universities. We have received intel from other major universities that they have found that to be a very useful report and helped them guide their work, especially in the decentralized universities, the more decentralized of the universities. So we're pushing forward on that front. We're pushing forward on student engagement. We're pushing forward on alumni engagement. We're pushing forward on external impact. So we're trying to work on all of these different fronts. We've got to. So here's a challenge. So I was about to use the phrase "firing on all cylinders," and that's probably not the best phrase. So we've got to think of the EV version of that. I guess Rivian isn't Rivian the one with all the wheel? They've got four engines, one in each, four motors, I should say, one in each wheel. So firing on all wheels.
It's the fire is the problem.
It's the
fire is the problem.
It's the
burning.
It's the yeah. We'll work on this. We'll work on this.
Sales are full.
Our sales are full. That's not the right one either. We'll work on this. We're going to work on this, okay? So, all right, so that's right. So can I make a few just quick naive remarks on education? So there's a question of, where we are right now is an incredible moment of change because we've got really cheap technologies, and so we can imagine a world where we have the power sector decarbonized, and we're Spinning all of our wheels? That's not the right one either. But wheels are fine. Okay. But we're all EVs. We're doing EVs and so forth. But we still got half. That's like half. Okay, that's half of emissions. We still have half of emissions to go. So there's a huge amount of work to do. But it's an opportunity to really say, wow, we've got a lot going on. At the same time, it is incredibly apparent to us how severe the actual reality of climate change is, and earlier than a lot of scientists had expected. So, what is it that can prompt additional action? I don't know. Anybody's theory of change, a piece of that theory of change has to be education of our youth, education of our youngest citizens, and helping them understand. And helping them understand in a very constructive way how the world is changing and how they can be part of having that change be something that's going to be okay for them, but at the same time adapting to them and doing what we need to do to minimize the worst damage. How you strike that balance so it doesn't just terrorize or doesn't get taken out of the curriculum, I don't know. That's not my skill set, but that seems to be an incredibly important challenge for everybody. I was just looking at the Yale Project on Climate Communication surveys, and I thought I'm just going to give you a few statistics that are really interesting and suggest how much work there is to do. So what fraction of the population thinks that global warming is happening? Turns out 72%, and actually it's a majority across almost every county in the United States. It's quite remarkable. What fraction think that it's anthropogenic? Well, that's 57%, so that's not 72%. So a lot of people think it's happening, but actually it's not anthropogenic. And if you look at that by county, that is, there's a lot of counties that are down in the 25% that think it's anthropogenic. So that's unlike the first one, which everybody seems to agree, there's actually big regional skew in the second one, the anthropogenic. How many hear about global warming is the word they use? So the word is how many times a week? Do you hear about global warming in the media at least one time a week? This is a remarkable statistic. So I think, how many times do I hear about global warming in the media? Well, maybe I listen to that stuff 30 times a day, including the podcasts. I don't know. What fraction of the population hears about it once a week in the media? 33%. Isn't that amazing? So, we're it seems like, I think we're in a little bit of a bubble right here. And the question is, how can this be communicated to the rest of the world and become part of the general conversation? And I think elementary and middle school and high school education has a huge, huge role in that, in doing this properly, surfacing these issues, having constructive conversations, moving forward in a calm, constructive, but aware fashion. How that happens, I don't know. It's a huge agenda, but I think any theory of change has to take that into account. So with that, let me turn this over.
Great. Well, it's a treat to be here. Good. We have a long purple line. That was the hope. So I'm Spencer Glendon, and it really is a treat to be here. I started working on climate change 10 years ago. Actually, at the time, I directed research at one of the largest financial institutions in the world. And I was interested in questions that nobody worked on. That was my main purview, was actually working on topics that nobody liked to work on. And so I started working on climate change because nobody worked on it. In fact, not just that, a little bit like Jim said, also nobody talked about it. And if anybody brought it up, people acted pretty weird. So people in the business world would start using language they would never use in the business world. Like, I don't believe in that. If you said, I don't believe in Ford Motor Company, or I don't believe in bonds, or I don't believe in money, you'd be disqualified. But somehow it was okay to say another thing, which was, I'm not sure. Now, finance is very interesting because it's the business of uncertainty. And so if you're in finance and you say, I don't want to talk about that because I'm not sure, you should be disqualified. Because you live in the world of uncertainty, you're never sure. And so what I discovered was there were these strange forms of language. And so I started working on climate change because no one else worked on it. And that's been exciting and lonely. And a lot of you understand what that loneliness is like. But the great thing is we now have a room full of people that is less lonely, and that's going to become even more so because everyone will work on climate change. So actually, Jim's a good example. He didn't expect to work on climate change. It then became his job. Actually, I now work almost all the time with climate scientists, almost all of whom started as non-climate scientists. So last night I sat down next to someone whose main interest was barnacles. Barnacles was what she loved. And now she's a climate scientist because the barnacles, to use a modern parlance, got really jacked up. And she wanted to understand why. And so I'm going to explain to you, I started an initiative called Probable Futures to make a bridge between climate science and culture. Because climate science turned out to be much better than economics. I have a PhD in economics from this institution, and climate science turned out to have better models that worked better, that were more predictive than models in economics, but nobody was using them. And so I wanted to make them useful. But what I really discovered, there was a question earlier on the panel, what motivated you, was this graph. So I started by reading old journals from the 70s, and I discovered this. And why this is relevant is this is the history of temperature on our planet, going back to 10,000 BCE. And what you can see is it goes sideways. It's almost no volatility. And I start in 10,000 BCE because that's when humans first settled. Humans, for the first 190,000 years, didn't build permanent structures. And then they did this weird thing. They started building permanent structures, and then they built little towns, and then they built schools. So there were no schools for the first 190,000 years that humans existed, and then there started being schools. And the thing is, once we started building schools, the climate didn't change. That green band is the green band of what we would call civilization. And I became obsessed with, why doesn't anybody know this? I actually talked to a great scientist at Stanford, and I said, just to be sure, civilization has only existed under stability, and he said, everybody knows that. And I said, nobody knows that. And so it's not just that it was so nice that it was actually everywhere on Earth was not too hot for us. There was no place on Earth too hot for a human body. And so people started making plans. They started assuming it. They started using language like 1 in 100. If I know the past, I know the future. People stopped paying attention to the physical world. Now, this was not true of native communities. This was not true of other societies. But the society that dominated the world physically did not think the physical world was interesting. If you want evidence of that, for a long time there was no AP Earth science. Because, hey, it just sits there. It doesn't change. And so what we did was we divided the world up into little slices, and everything became someone else's job. And so I turned out to be interested in this thing that was nobody's job. Really not at the university. Nobody at Harvard at the time studied climate change. They studied maybe the atmosphere or a river, but they didn't study climate change. And what I discovered is basically a stable climate is the foundation for all of society. We built everything else on top of it, and we treat it like it's solid, but it is not solid. All those things are tippy. And so we talked about civilization. You could argue this is sort of the peak of civilization. This is Paris. That's the Champs-Élysées running right down the center. That's why, the reason they built the Champs-Élysées was for the storm sewer. The storm sewer of Paris does not have much capacity because Paris rains often. It's where they invented the umbrella. It never rains hard, until now. And so now Paris has flooding. Actually, might interest you that London, which is thought of as rainy, the storm sewer is built for a 1/4 inch of rain a day maximum. It never rains hard, and now they have floods. And every building there was built for a range of temperature that is now being violated. That is a data graphic of climate risk. Because the risk has shifted, the distribution has shifted, and everything in that room on that picture is in the wrong place. And so we need to prepare. What does that preparation entail? Not just thinking about warmer temperatures, but the loss of stability. That stability that we took for granted. So we need a new skill, and that is climate awareness. We need to be aware of the world around us. We need to bring the physical world into our lives. The good thing is children already do that. We just teach them to move it out of their purview. We need to change the way we think about this, because this is what's happening. And if the climate breaks altogether, it was said eloquently before, you can have the best school system you want. If the Earth is on fire, or if billions of people are moving, it won't matter. Because this is the longer time horizon. And the reason we know this is because we had those narrow specialists who figured out the history of temperature on Earth. Why, for the first 190,000 years, didn't they settle? because they didn't live in the green band. They lived in the volatile blue area. They had to chase the nice weather all the time. The weather was not stable, so they had to move. So we built probable futures to build this bridge, and I'm going to show you some maps. I'm going to pick 28 degrees C, 82 Fahrenheit wet bulb days in Dallas. That may sound like a mouthful, but I showed it to the guy from Dallas. He's like, I know exactly what that is. What that is a day when it's 82 degrees and 100% humidity, or it's 86 and 85% humidity, or it's 100 degrees and 45% humidity. It's unsafe for children to go out at recess. That's what that is. So we built a tool where you can go anywhere in the world and click on a cell and see the past. So you may notice there's a little thing along the top there. It says 0.5 degrees, 1 degrees, 1.5, 2.5, 2, 2.5, 3. At 0.5 degrees, which is this map, which is 1970 to 2000, the late 20th century, when we set all of the standards for all of the buildings in America, there was in Dallas 1 such day a year on an average year, 4 in a warm year. So climate is a distribution. When we went from 0.5 to 1, it became more common. 1.5, it's yet more common. But look what's happening in Louisiana, further down in Texas. And now you see these ranges are really wide now. There might be no such days, and there might be a month of such days. We need to prepare for this because 2 degrees is coming. We are not stopping at 1.5. 1.5, the odds in the science community are now taken. It's 50-50 in the next 4 years that we pass 1.5. And so this is 2.5, this is 3. This is not safe for children in much of the South. But we need to understand, so the purpose of this was to make vivid what could be in a way that's motivating and clarifying. I'm going to show you one more set of graphs, because you can zoom out and look at the world of extreme drought. So this is the late 20th century. Extreme drought is defined locally. So whatever it is, it's not that the Amazon drought and the Sahara drought are the same, but this is extreme drought, and in the late 20th century it was extreme, so it was rare. This is a probability map. Just going from 0.5 to 1 degree C, all of these places start having a more than 10% chance annually of extreme drought. And that map is already the map of where we've had droughts and on fire. These data are astoundingly good. But look what happens when we go from 1 to 1.5. Yellow means more than a third of the time. What was rare is much of the time, and orange is most of the time. And the northern coast of Africa becomes basically part of the Sahara. And so these are the futures we need to understand in a way that's much more vivid. And so you're going to need imagination to live in that world. It's not just a plan, it's imagining. Because the future is usually portrayed in one of 2 ways. Somehow there are lots of EVs and it's the same, or it's Mad Max. That's it. That's the 2 choices we're given. Number 1 is no longer possible because we cannot go back. Number 2 is avoidable. So we have to live in the probable futures in between. That's why we named this probable futures. We can't pick one future. There's a range, and we can choose between them, and we have to treat them with some uncertainty. So let's populate those with stories. And I'm going to be generous about what I mean by stories. How to live well under realistic constraints that are not miracles. And we've actually done some work with storytellers in Hollywood. This came from a writer from The Handmaid's Tale. We learned this yesterday. If your story doesn't include climate change, it is science fiction. And so the genres of storytelling, what are they? They're like budgets. That's a story. Essays, songs, books. And so the climate will be harsher, but we can live better. So encourage kids to stay attuned to the natural world. Let's reawaken that interest in adults. I'm partly promoting something. It is totally free. It's a free global utility, so I'm not selling it. We call it marketing, but it's not even a market. Let's reawaken that interest in adults, and it's written to do that. So there's lots of informational material. This is where we usually end. At the bottom, make friends, learn to cook, dance and sing. Those are climate strategies because you can do those in any climate, and you need community. So I'm now happy to join the fellow panelists, but and I don't know if I stayed within 7 minutes, but anyway, thank you.
Thank you. As we're getting up here, I just can't, I know that you've got some questions, but I just can't. Thank you for sharing your climate story.
Oh, yeah.
I think we all have stories about how we got interested in climate originally, and I thought what was interesting about your story was that it started by looking at some data, and that's actually how I got interested in climate too, working back in the 1990s. I started out sort of, with a sort of a healthy academic skepticism. Basically, the science modelers would say, trust me, I have a big model, I'm from MIT and I'm smart, so this is the way it is. And being an econometrician, I never was totally convinced, so I started doing a bunch of econometric analysis or statistical analysis of the climate data and concluded that they were right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, the first climate, so I don't read newspapers. My practice is to read books, good magazines, and journal articles. So when I started reading papers from the 70s. And I was just astonished at how good they were. But also what was interesting was the skeptics were mostly scientists who said, it can't be that simple. It can't just be our behavior and our burning of stuff. And so what happened was one after the other, scientists replicated the results. And like, God, it really is that easy. It is that simple. And it's one of the things I find compelling about it is that it's intuitive also. It's like, it's just us burning up the planet. How could it just be that?
Yeah.
And so it turns out that it started with the notion that it was complex and turned out to be intuitive, resonant, like kids get it, and then adults unlearn it because like it can't be, that's gotta be something else.
Yeah. And it's easy to throw in disinformation and make it complicated, but in fact, the statistical footprint is incredibly strong, uncontroversial.
Yeah.
I'm happy to just kind of sit over here and listen, and you guys can keep going if you like, or I could, throw in a few questions.
You're the boss.
Yeah.
Guys, did you notice what he just said? Let's make note of that.
That's kind of a Harvard in-joke, I think.
Definitely. So thank you both. I want to keep this conversation going, and certainly I am enjoying listening to both of you because, as we said, this is an invitation to learn this year as a community. But I'm curious, so we've known for a while that this is going on. Why hasn't there been movement? Why hasn't there been traction? What have we been doing wrong so that it's just getting worse? So what should we not be doing? What should we not be repeating?
I'm happy to go first, or you can?
Oh yeah, go ahead. I mean,
sure.
We'll have, it'll be interesting to hear what you say.
All right, I will, so I think there are two big reasons why we didn't make progress on this. And one of them has to do with essentially the moral and the moral philosophy, if you will, of Western civilization, which is we will solve all problems with more. All problems will be solved with more. And actually, economics is a very interesting representation of that. It started out as a discipline for figuring out how to deal with constraints, and then it got really obsessed with the infinite. Bob Solow once said, once you start thinking about growth, it's hard to think about anything else. And so we started thinking without limits. And the thinking without limits, once you start thinking that way, it's very hard to then reimpose limits. And so I think that there is an inherent unlimited nature to our culture that's saying, no, we can't have everything, is endemic. So one of my favorite examples of this actually is the endangered species idea, which is we need to figure out the minimum number of these things to keep and then just stay above that. And so there's this very interesting debate about tuna. There's one group of people who says we should still be fishing tuna, and the other group of people says we should stop fishing tuna. And the people who say they should stop say we've killed 97% of the tuna, there are only 3% left, and the other people say there are twice as many tuna as you think. So they think we've killed 94% of the tuna. And so the idea that the people who think 97 is like 94% is like there's way more tuna. We've only killed 94% of them is representative of this mindset that just tell us where the absolute limits are. And then within this, I think we developed disciplines that are just so narrow, and they expanded human knowledge, what we know, but none of us really knew it. And so discovering, for me, I started hanging out with scientists. I just started calling them, saying, can I talk to you? I've read your paper from 1985. And they're like, you're one of 9 people who read my paper from 1985. And I would go see them and talk to them. And I discovered that their knowledge it wasn't their job to spread it. And nobody built bridges around that circle that I showed you. Nobody built the bridges between one thing and another. And I have 2 indictments of the university as an institution. The first is this narrow specialization, and the other is the obsession with the new. So what I discovered was there was lots of cool stuff that academics had already, that was the sort of, everybody knows that, and nobody knew it. And so it was no longer novel. So when I proposed probable futures, I said, could we make a tool that people would find useful, they could use, would take the best of science, make it handy? Like, sure, wouldn't be hard. And I said, well, that's great. And they're like, no, it's not hard. Like, that's not interesting. I don't want to work on something that uses already known things and is really just execution and following through. I want to do novel things. And what I discovered was the world was littered with university projects that had been done as one-offs, and then were like broken satellites orbiting the Earth as space garbage that are not updated. And so this brings me to my very last point, which we stopped valuing maintenance. We value innovation so much that we stopped valuing taking care of things. So the maintenance department in America is the department that fixes things that already broke. And the idea that we just take care faded from culture. And so we just didn't have the instincts or the moral framework or the bridges. And so it just sat around as someone else's job. Someone else, for what it's worth, I like looking at the history of language. Until the early 20th century, the term someone else didn't appear in the English language. It's a term of scale. It's not you, it's not Jim, it's not Bridget, it's not anybody, it's someone else. It's a novel term for scale. And so I think those are the ingredients that I found when I went asking that question.
Okay.
I'm going to share one story, very, very short story that I think builds on your sort of growth economists' challenges of challenges. And you mentioned endangered species. I was at a day-long thing run by the Congressional Budget Office, but bringing in academics to talk about what are the budgetary impacts of climate change. And there was this one, we were just going through this, it's good exercise, health insurance and floods and the sort of things. And then there was this line item on the Endangered Species Act, and we started talking about that. And the estimates were that it was going to go up a little bit, and then it was going to go down. I said, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why aren't we going to be spending a lot of money on endangered species? Well, it's because they go extinct, and then you don't have to spend the money.
Yeah.
So let me answer Bridget's question.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give a different take. Yours is about societal moving in the wrong direction, and you probably won't like this. Maybe this is controversial. I'm going to label what you just said as degrowth. Would that be fair?
No.
Okay. Let me.
You can label. I mean, I'm happy to be. Choose your label, okay. And we'll see if it fits.
Let me give you a different answer, which is, I think that there was a general awareness. If you go back to the work of Bill Nordhaus back in the late 1980s and 1990s, who really brought this forward as an economist, and then many other people, the problem at the time was that there was a recognition that climate change was anthropogenic among the scientists and among the economists. That wasn't such a controversial thing. There was a recognition that it comes in the primary instance from burning CO2, and so the question was, how do you burn less CO2? How do you make that transition? And so the fundamental framing of the problem at the time was that there wasn't really any reasonable alternative but burning fossil fuels if you want to have energy to support modern society. We didn't have cheap wind and solar. We had incredibly expensive wind and solar. There were attempts to have nuclear power, but that was not well adopted by society. early, and actually it's like really expensive, and that was sort of, there was a period in which that was really thought to be the power of the future, but it didn't work out. So we just didn't really have, and there's only so many rivers you want to dam up, so we didn't really have potential for more hydro. So sort of what you were stuck with, and for cars, you didn't have any alternatives really. So, as you've probably seen the pictures of the EVs from the 1980s or 1990s, who would want to drive that, So we didn't really have an alternative. So what are you stuck with? You're stuck with, well, you better conserve, you better wear more sweaters, we better have a carbon tax. It's all of these things. It's not stuff that's going to be very palatable. And so people didn't want that. It wasn't politically acceptable. The economists couldn't sort of get off that being the solution because no one could think of other solutions. We're in a remarkably different situation today where we really can imagine. You don't have to, frankly, you shouldn't actually have to have a subsidy to buy an EV if you have enough sort of resource flow that you're not cash constrained, because EVs, and even today, an EV is cheaper over the life of the vehicle than an internal combustion engine vehicle. So, we have these alternatives today so that we can think about much broader policy solutions. That's not to say that we have good answers to steel or to concrete or to agriculture or to jet aviation fuels. We have some really important challenges ahead, but at least they're cabined. So I think that my answer is going to be much more about the evolution of technology and the fact that we then politically weren't able to do the hard things that would have been necessary to reduce consumption.
So I have a feeling if I let you guys go back and forth, you would definitely argue about how we interpret the past. But I want to pivot and say, because really that question was meant to be about how do we take the lessons from the past about what not to do as we look to the future? Because I want to press on a little bit. Yes, we have things now that we didn't have before. But just because we have solar, just because we have wind, I don't think we're going to snap our fingers and all of a sudden solve climate. It's going to take more than that. And certainly, Spencer, the thing that you mentioned, we grapple with as an institution. I think the Ed School does a remarkably good job in rewarding and incentivizing when we discover something. It doesn't just end up in a journal article. Part of what we're trying to do and why we had the panel earlier is about how do we get that into practice. But research use is incredibly complicated and difficult. Yep. So what do we carry forward from those lessons from the past, regardless of what you might disagree on that, but what is it going to take going forward?
Can I go first on this one?
Yeah.
Because I want to amplify something that both of you said, which is sort of your critique of academics and the stress on the new, and then I love the image of the broken satellites going around, because I think that is a valid critique of a lot of how academic works. That's the incentive structure. We give tenure
based on pushing the frontier.
That is exactly right. That's exactly what you get tenure for. What we are trying to do with the Salati Institute and what we're trying to do at Harvard is to say there are lots of hard problems. There are lots of problems that have a lot of intellectual interest in them, but they're also ones that are applied and practical and have real-world payoffs. So let's really try to work on those. That's going to require durable commitments to working on that problem. Let's suppose you pick aviation fuels. That is not an easy problem. That is a problem that's going to take 20 years to figure out. We don't know. We sort of have maybe an idea of what the process might be to think about it, but we really don't know the solutions. And so that's going to require a durable commitment. An institution like a university can make those durable commitments. Individual researchers are disincentivized from doing that, but it's possible for us to make the durable commitments to working on a hard problem. I just happen to use one that I'm personally interested in, but you can think about that across the board. So that is making those durable commitments, and that's exactly what you're trying to do here at GSE, thinking about how can we make a durable commitment to moving forward with helping school districts figure out how to green their and make more resilient their infrastructure, and how can we really think hard about the K-12 curriculum and education and so forth. That is a project. That is not a one-off. That is an ongoing commitment, and it is fantastic that you are doing that. That is just like, it's just great, because there's need, and this is the place to do it.
Education, the whole education sector is an important lever for this change. And there are things that we can do that we will do and that will be important for the world?
Yeah.
Spencer?
So I have a couple of things. The first is, I think it may sound squishy, but I think we do need a different mindset. And the first part of it, I would say, is a risk-aware mindset. We now live in a very risky world, and every decision we make changes the profile of risks prospectively. We don't need to go into my critique of the Nordhaus models, but they're not risk models.
No.
And so what happens is the models don't tell you, in fact, it might interest you, the economic models that told us that it was expensive, the papers that were published say things like, we may discover we prefer living in deserts. And that's a Nordhaus quote from one of his most famous papers, and the point is, the models kept producing productivity infinitely, and no bad things happened. And part of the reason for that is that today's adults didn't experience bad things.
Yeah.
So if you take the 55-year-old CEO, during their entire career, interest rates went down, there were no nuclear wars, they didn't even experience inflation, let alone one recession, and so it became a culture of maximization and not a culture of risk. And so it's been very interesting to talk about, so you talk about climate change in the United States to, I'm 53, to 50 to 60-year-old to 65-year-old men, and they talk about technology. You talk with people in Africa, you talk with people in Mexico, you talk with people who survived the Cultural Revolution, they talk about risk. And we do not have a risk mindset in this country, and we promoted the idea of maximization. And I think it's the kids telling us, hey, like, sure, maybe it all works out, but that's not the lesson you're telling me in my life as a child. And so the lesson that, well, it would be expensive to reduce risk, it's like a kid saying, well, my behavior, I'm doing something that's damaging, but it's kind of expensive, Mom, for me to change my behavior. I do think that prioritizing a risk mentality as part of our consciousness and building it into our models. So I'll give a little example that we'll leave Bill Nordhaus out of it. I've talked with the people who run many of the models that govern some of the biggest banks in the country. And what they want from me over and over again is one number to put in their spreadsheet. Just tell me the number so that I can figure out the price. And I say, but there's this wide range of outcomes, and the range of outcomes keeps getting wider. And I can tell you where uncertainty is growing the most. And where there's uncertainty, you shouldn't offer a price. You don't know. We have no mentality of, you know what, we need to back off. So it's not that I'm degrowth. It's that I'm opposed to two things, or I think, my views, I think we've endangered ourselves by maximizing, and we've endangered ourselves by not thinking about risks, and mostly because we didn't experience them. And if you look back far enough, you find real risks, you find bad outcomes. And so the models that tell you it will cost 2 or 3% of GDP, those models constrain the participants to never move. There's no migration permitted in the model. There's no political unrest in the model because the testing period had no political unrest. And it's not that I have a better estimate for political unrest, but I think maybe they shouldn't have had decimal places, and they should have had super wide ranges, and they should have had lots of use of what I now understand that this term is called the habitual present tense. You say London is rainy. What that means is it always was rainy, it is now rainy, always will be rainy. A lot of our models take things from the past, use the habitual present tense to describe an infinite future. I think we just said, this is what it was like. And we don't know what it'll be like, but we know what our influences are. And there's a kind of modesty to it. And so risk awareness and modesty, giving space for nature, so you're not debating over 94 versus 97% of the tuna. That kind of thing, I think, would make a big difference. And kids get it, but it is part of education.
So Spencer, you're talking a lot about our recent history. Bad things didn't happen, so it's difficult for adults to think about really bad things happening. So So I want to transition a little bit to bring this closer to education. I want to apologize to everyone. I'm sorry. I ended up with a panel with 3 economists. You've heard a little bit about models. But as you can tell, we are bringing different things to this conversation. But as we said earlier, this is a civilization problem. This is a problem for all of society. We've talked today about the education sector. You both have spent a lot of time thinking about other sectors. How can we work together or bring education to have a seat at the table or to have other sectors reach into education, since it's going to take all of us?
So I'll start just because I have something simple to say, which is that actually we mostly need to educate adults right now. And so one of the things we need to, I think the world needs help from ed school people, because there are millions of people for whom sustainability is now becoming part of their life, and they have a super disorganized framework for it. So they immediately start talking about EVs or solar panels or Exxon or something. They have a lot of facts, but they don't have a framework. And so developing frameworks for adults to start working on things. I really like I'm sorry, I don't know your name in the 3 seats back.
Tina.
To design, the kinds of design thinking, the kinds of learning. We have a lot of people who know theoretically kind of a lot about climate change, but it's super messy. Giving them some context so they can bring it into their world, whether they're a superintendent or something else, is urgent. And so that's part of why Probable Future started out as a data tool and is now mostly an educational tool, because what we need is a framework for people to bring it into their lives.
Jim?
So I'm actually going to disagree a little bit. I think, if I think about, I've had so many conversations with adults that their awareness of their climate concerns are actually driven by conversations with their children. And, it's tough if you're sitting over dinner and your daughter or your son says to you, well, Dad, what have do you do anything that is, good for the planet?
Or Greta said, Mom and Dad. That's what I hear.
Yeah. So I think it's incredibly, if you think this analogy is used a lot, but if you think about the remarkable transformation in the adoption of gay marriage. I mean, boy, that was really driven by education at the youngest levels. In my view, that's a big transformation of the youth accepting something that was difficult for the adults to accept, and then it just became part of our culture. So I have to really think that, now I know this isn't operating on the time frames, this is not on a 5-year time scale, but it's arguably on a 10 or 15-year time scale, and these challenges are going to continue. So I actually really do, my own opinion, for what it's worth, is that K-12 education is incredibly important, but it's also very hard. So I'm going to go back to my comments that I said before. I don't know what the right framing is. I think, is it helpful in a K-12 education to show that picture of how it's not safe for kids to go outside in Houston for, at a 2 or 3 degree world? Is that something that helps them understand change, or is it something that just makes them incredibly depressed or worried or wondering what, how they can
Fernando and I have
handle that?
Talked about this. I've actually talked about this with some of the previous panelists as well. So it depends if you just tell them this is it, or if you say, we're going to need to figure out how to live in a world that's different. So I'll give you an example from people working in China. Drought is a big problem in China. Assigning 7th graders a project of thinking about how are we going to deal with this is very different than just telling them that's the deal.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that we've spent a lot of time with psychologists to understand there's a big difference between anxiety and fear. Fear is something that you can name specifically and then do something about. kids have lots of anxiety and it's miserable. But if you say, here's the thing we need to prepare for, then it's tractable. And I think that the reason, so it's absolutely imperative for kids. I don't think we have any disagreement about the importance of kids learning about it. The difference, I would say, is we need adults to bring it into their actions. So gay marriage is, I think, an important, good comparison for some reasons, but it didn't become part of your life if you weren't gay. And so it needs to be part of your job if you work in any administration. And that transition is both cultural and practical. And so I think that, and the other thing is just teaching teachers. I mean, that's part of why I'm here, is like the adults we need to teach are the ones who help the kids learn in a productive way. So that map can be terrible or great, depending on the context within which it's delivered. And so the other thing is just, I really can't emphasize enough that the physical world is amazing. And starting with, we have a great planet, and it used to be perfect. And it's gonna be less perfect, but we need to figure out how to live in it, is not a hopeless statement. There's some sadness in it and some ownership of that sadness. But it's a project. It's a lot like aging. Like, my body is worse than 3 weeks ago. But I can figure out how to live within that constraint without despondency. And so saying, you know, life is going to be a little harder, but we could live better in it. And this is why I think that, I really think that we have limits. That's okay. Life can be awesome within those limits. Now, it may prove that we can also grow within those limits. But behaving as if the limits don't exist is part of what the children are rebelling against. And so we give them limits in other contexts, and then we free ourselves from them in other ways. I think just living in ranges and limits with a kind of, that's a framework that is actually deeply human and can be internalized. And so the idea of the maps, they're filled of stories. You click on a cell and see what happened in Dallas. The story about Dallas actually is that Dallas put the baseball stadium indoors because people stopped going.
Yeah.
But they made it a clear roof so it felt like a sunny day. But it's always 72 degrees at the Texas Rangers games, every single time. And you can say, well, that's great. We can play baseball all the time. But you know what? Every sport in Texas is now played inside. And that's just sad. And so making kids, one of the things, I'll give you a good example. I think summer vacation will go away in a lot of places, and it will become fall vacation so that kids can go outside. Now that's heartbreaking and super practical. Like, let's not have times when kids can't go outside be the times we let them go outside. And so autumn can be great. Maybe it's winter, but that's the kind of practical decision as stewards we need to make. And that's not a framework that's currently available. We've been teaching meteorologists. TV meteorologists have no idea. They weren't trained in climate. They were trained in short-term forecasting. They don't know how to explain, but they're getting calls every day from the viewers. And they're desperate for somebody to help them. And so, anyway, I think there's a way to create education that makes the world more interesting and equips people to live in it in a much more viable way that actually is more human anyhow, and doesn't have this triumphalism of solving it all, but living well within it. There will be some solutions, but there will be lots of accommodations. Treating those as losses would be sad. So we can figure out, kids can get hard things. Here are the limits, but there's so much good. Let's live well within them. And then we have the part that Fernando gets to, which is he talked about ways we can make it better. So I like the writing of Wendell Berry very much. He says there are two ways of thinking about the world. One is extractive and the other is nurturing. You can treat farming this way, you can treat mining this way. We're just gonna have to take care of the climate. So that's a new job, taking care of the climate. It sounds kind of cool. But we treated it before as if it was something we wanted to just have for free. And so taking care of the climate can be exciting for young people and old people. I'm pretty excited about it. And so that's another thing we can teach people. It's a way of saying, okay, we can also affect the limits. We just need to think about the limits.
So as we're getting towards the end of our time, we have an audience here. I know we have an audience online and others who are going to see this recording. We have people in all forms, all ways of education. We do have teachers and principals. We have technology folks, policy people, future superintendents, entrepreneurs, people who are in the field. What's your advice to them? Or what's your invitation to them as, again, we think across sector, again, with you both having lots of experience and often talking to people who aren't educators, but obviously education has an important role in this. What's your advice or what's your invitation?
I say a couple of different things. I actually want to chime into your previous question, and then I'm going to then I will actually answer your question. I think that, the comments, those are terrific comments. It's very inspiring, if rather sobering. Let me think a little bit about the students that we teach here at Harvard and the students that I teach in my class. I teach, among the things I do is I teach a freshman seminar, first-year seminar on U.S. climate and energy policy, and not surprisingly, there's a fair number of students who want to take that. It's pretty interesting, and one of the big themes, the overarching theme of that course is what does it actually? How does one make change? So what is the theory of change? How do you make change? Is it through the legal system? Is it through technology? Is it through changing our orientations about how we think about society and growth? Is it through legislative processes? Is it through activism and so forth? And I think that the message that I try to convey, and now I'm going to sound very Harvard-centric, that message that I try to convey to my students in the end, and for them to get to the point is this is not a topic for despair. This is a topic where we have to be realistic about what's happening, but we also have to realize that every individual has the opportunity to make a big difference, and that is especially true for Harvard undergraduates. Harvard undergraduates they will be the leaders of tomorrow, and they have an opportunity.
Harvard graduates, just to throw that in there too.
And Harvard graduates, well, I'm teaching first years, so I'm talking first years, but they will go on to do great things, and that is to say they have the opportunity to give to the world. I like to end with the phrase, the phrase that I'm sure many are familiar with. To whom much has been given, much is expected. And I think that is a very apt phrase for our students, and indeed, it's an expectation that they can live up to. So going back to your question, I actually think that one thing that really can make a difference is learning by seeing. So if superintendents or school districts say, gosh, I'm actually kind of worried about these really heavy rainstorms. We've already had some flooding. It's been a pain in the neck. We've had to close down the school for an unexpected week. It's going to happen some more. Let's actually make a deal of fixing this, and let's make that an educational moment. Or is this an opportunity for us to explain why? Yeah, let's go on to electric school buses, and here's the advantages, and here's why we're going to go to electric school buses. They'll make the ride less. It'll be safer. It'll be less polluting for the kids. It'll be better for the places that the kids get picked up in, and it will also be overall good for the transition. And actually now, I think with some of the federal subsidies, it's actually one that's an affordable change for the school districts. It's kind of a chore logistically, but it's another teaching moment. So greening your campuses is an opportunity to get all of the community engaged in understanding how we can actually individually make a difference, recognizing that there are these challenges, yet we have an opportunity to contribute.
Thank you, Jim.
So I would say one thing is you just try something. And there are two motivations for this. The first is we do not know what is going to work. So I actually spent a lot of time talking to climate communicators, and they all had this view that you do not want to share bad news with people. Like, people will shut down if you share bad news. The scholarship on that turns out to be terrible. Like, it's just not actually true. What happens is if you just kind of feel awkward about something and never bring it up, then people will not do anything. And it turns out we don't know what will change people's behavior. The reason this is an empirical problem, right? We've run this experiment over and over and over again, and we got no positive results. But it doesn't mean that the thing that was tried 20 years ago doesn't work. It means it didn't work. But I just tell people, try things, because we don't know what will work. There will be a lot of change, and you can make something change. So the two things I say as a practical, one is walk around wherever you are and start noticing the assumptions. What are the assumptions in your life? And figure out how many of them might be vulnerable. It's a framework for starting to understand how the climate works and how you connect with it. The architecture, the diet, how you vacate, how you recreate, what you do, all is based on a set of assumptions. Start to see those assumptions, and the world gets super interesting, and climate change becomes less foreign. And then the last part is already been said by other people more eloquently, but bring it into whatever space you're in. Whatever group you're in, so you're a group of moms, you're a group of teachers, you're a group of people in the facilities department. Just ask, is there anything we should be doing? The answer may be no, but asking that question is very provocative and very helpful. And it turns out that there actually is something to do for most people, and then you feel like you're part of it.
Please join me in thanking Spencer and Jim for being on this last panel. And as we close, I want to thank you all for joining us here today at HGSC and online. And many thanks to all of the speakers that we had today and all those who helped plan this event and support this event. Your hard work is very, very much appreciated. As we've discussed throughout the day, we are at an important and urgent moment, a critical time to build resilience given how climate change is already affecting us, and to take action to improve things for the future. As we've seen today, education and leaders are already driving impact, and now we must broaden this vision and scale our impact. So again, this convening is just the kickoff to a series of events and activities we will be hosting over the next several months, and very excited to get our students involved at our next event. So be on the lookout for our future events as we continue this conversation. Also looking forward to working more with the Salata Institute, and hope all of you will also check out what's going on at the larger university. But thank you again, and again, I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.